I'm here.
Can you hear us in the room okay? All right, good.
Yeah, thanks. I have to say, I miss being there in person. It's much more lively and engaging.
I just got a message from Chris. She and Yinka are waiting for the shuttle at the hotel, so they should be a few more minutes. I told them no problem. I think we're good on time for today, so.
Okay.
All right. Good morning and good evening to everyone. We had a really productive day yesterday, and some of us had a very lovely dinner last night as well, right before the weather turned on us. But today is really dedicated to the curriculum. So we have lots of time, pretty much our entire time allocated this morning and early afternoon in Evanston is dedicated to going through these sessions. I know we had talked about a couple of things yesterday that we wanted to keep note of for our curriculum discussions. But this is really our chance to review it, make sure everything makes sense, make sure everything meets our goals and our priorities that we had talked about yesterday for the participants and the event. And so this is our chance to change things. And then the goal is that once we conclude the meeting for today, it's done. It moves through our process and it goes into our production and editing team so that we can make sure that it's localized in all the appropriate languages and that we have plenty of time. So we also sent the materials to Barry. So he'll have an opportunity to weigh in as well outside of this meeting, of course, because he couldn't attend. But by the end of the week, we'll have his feedback as well. And so then we'll incorporate everything and move it forward. Any questions or thoughts before we start reviewing the sessions? Great. Well, then I'm going to turn it over to Madeline, who is really the architect and designer of the materials, and she's going to lead us through our session review.
Thanks, Michelle. So first of all, the materials for our virtual attendees are in the chat. So if you don't see those there, let me know. For our in-person attendees, we are in the binder. So there is a curriculum tab. And the first document you will see is our welcome letter. And then just behind that begins our leader's guide. That's an important piece. We hold that place in the back of your binder. So in the back pocket is your workbook, and it is organized by day. So it will be paper clipped by day, so we can kind of follow along in the leader's guide in the binder and then have the workbook next to us for kind of ease of access and review. And then, as Michelle mentioned, it's been shared with Barry. We'll review it together today, and by the end of this week, it will begin to move through our production cycle. So we'll share it with our global communications team for copy editing. From there, it will move through localization, translation, and finally design, and be delivered back to us in the spring and in early March for this event. When you're taking a look at the leader's guide, someone in your binder, we have our key points, we have our learning objectives, we have the workbook sections, and we have the timeline that's in the leader's guide. The first session that is taking place Monday, March 27th. It's for both roles, both EMGAs and EPNCs. The session content will be tracked by role, so there'll be one session for each role that are occurring simultaneously. It begins with an intro. Move to the next page, where the facilitator will welcome the participants. We'll review the learning objectives. Participants can also review learning objectives at the top of their workbook page. And the learning objectives in this session are focused on understanding really the function of the roles, emphasizing the ability to prioritize time management and productivity in the role. And since it's a track session, it does include some content by role that's specific to each role, and that's indicated in the highlighting at the top of the leader's guide and kind of throughout, if you noticed. The unhighlighted content is for everyone. The introduction includes a key point and discussion question that's for all the roles. And then we move to the your role section of the leader's guide. You'll see bolded.
Madeline, can I
Yes.
just make one point?
Yep.
The first question, what are you excited to learn to prepare for your role? I rephrased it. I just wondered if this might sound better, what are you excited to learn in preparing for your role?
We then move to our Paul Harris quote. So the leader's guide asks the facilitator to indicate that in the workbook. That's the first section in the workbook. Then the facilitator reviews the key points that follow and discusses some of the elements of the roles that participants are undertaking. Then from there, we move to the what is your role section. And that asks participants to answer the activities questions in small groups. Participants can use the regional leader manual. That will be in the workbook appendix during the activity. And the questions in the activity focus on anticipated skills and knowledge needed in the role, the actions and activities that the regional leaders will plan for as they begin the role, and the district's teams that they'll work with, which prepare them kind of that next section.
Just one question.
That's good.
The question, who will you work with on the district teams?
Mhm.
Would it make sense here to also include on the regional team? Or do you think that that would be addressed somewhere else?
Yeah, in the teamwork section. So this, we're kind of thinking of the district team specific for the role. And then in our teamwork section, we branch it out to kind of the larger teams.
Okay, thank you.
Then in addition to that question, in the activity, the facilitator asks the participants about the skills and knowledge that they'll need, how they'll kind of prioritize certain actions to start their term, and then closes the section by discussing the support that will be available to the regional leaders. Then the last section in the leader's guide.
Madeline, I'm sorry.
Fine.
I just wanted to check in. Is
Yeah.
the term outreach clear to everyone? Do we have any concerns that that might be a harder word for English as a second language people? Or is that clear?
Good point. Tasks
Could you
or
repeat that again, Sarah? Because
So it is in the workbook under what is your role? And it says, what tasks or outreach will you prioritize starting on 1 July? And I'm just wondering if the word outreach will be clear to everyone.
it's in leader's guide and workbook. Yeah. Yeah. So in Leader's Guide, section 1, page 4, towards the top, it's the second bolded question. Yep, correct.
thank you, Sarah. That would be for non-native speakers. Yeah.
More
Since the-
difficult. What about communication or something like that?
The following question talks about working with the district teams. So I'm wondering if we could just strike the outreach and the question simply becomes, what tasks will you prioritize?
Because, right, if you're reaching out to someone, if you're communicating with someone, that would be a task.
Ask. Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah, and I don't know if this was already given as a tip, if you pull out either the workbook or the leader's guide, and you can have them out of the binder, have them next to each other.
Any other questions before we move on?
Just point of clarification,
Mhm.
the second bullet point in the leader's guide under what tasks will you prioritize?
Many
It's
starting.
the lower part is shaded, your fund development staff.
Mhm.
I'm assuming that's just for the EMGAs.
Yes,
Yeah,
correct.
okay, thank you.
And then we end that bullet point on the next page with your staff specialists divided for EPNCs versus EM. Yeah. Good clarification.
In the colored version, it may be a little bit more clear. The blue is for the
Okay.
EMGA. and the
I
green is
just
for
brought mine because I
EPNCs. Yeah,
made notes on it.
Right.
That's fine.
Just-
It might be
So I
a bit
brought my
easier to
own.
see.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, and in the versions, the EMGAs and the EPNCs will only see what's applicable and appropriate to them. So this is kind of for us, we have everything. But Dory makes a good point that the color helps a little bit, yeah. So again, we're in the section 1, page 5 on the right in your binder, working with district leaders. That corresponds to the workbook section. Strategies to support districts, that's on the back of your workbook page. Participants can take notes in their workbook during this section. Then the facilitator starts the next section by asking about the district's teams and their questions and key points that are again tracked by the role, noted by highlighting. The questions focus on fundraising and fundraising promotion strategies, and then the key points on how the regional leader will serve as a resource in the districts. So this part we,
Madeline,
Yeah, go ahead.
May I ask, because I'm struggling with the guide. So can you please make a note of the number on where you are
Yes.
referring to? Because I'm really lost. You're speaking so quickly and then
I will slow
I'm
down.
looking for where
Thank
are
you.
we?
Thank you, Lise. I am on session 1, page 5. That is on the right hand side of your binder. Okay.
Madeline, under the list of people that
Mhm.
you will work with at the district
Mhm.
level, I just made a note that maybe you could add district fundraising chair. I believe that that's still one of the required positions on the district Rotary Foundation committee. Fundraising chair was one of the required positions, I believe, unless that's changed.
Yeah, we can look into that just to confirm it.
Yeah. And then the session ends, so moving to the next page, we'll be on page 6. Then on the right, page 7 in your binder, session ends with a review, providing an overview of the content from the session, and the facilitator closes the session by referring the participants to a your goals section and the evaluation. The evaluation is something we'll take a look at towards the end of today.
Madeline,
Yes.
Can I-
Christine?
thanks. Can I just ask maybe kind of the room and thinking from the facilitator standpoint?
Hmm.
I'm in the leader's guide on page 1-6. I'm looking at the EMGA key points in the aqua color that extend onto page 7. That looks like a lot of information for the facilitator to say. I know we have a new guide that we're looking to promote.
Yep.
I'm just wondering if there's a way for us to shorten some of that or look for other ways that we can deliver some of that information, because those key points look quite lengthy to me.
Yeah,
I
I
was wondering maybe that the second point, which mentions that there is a guide that's
Mhm.
coming, maybe then that third point, instead of listing all the resources, maybe we could do a handout or something that says the
Mhm.
guide, for more information, here's the handout. I know it's silly to have a handout telling them to go to a
Mhm.
website, but that kind of lists some of the different resources
Mhm.
because
Could
they
we,
don't have to remember everything.
could we have a link to it somewhere? Because also managing the handouts and getting them translated and getting them to the right individual. We try to avoid handouts for that reason.
Just removing that last bullet point and referring to the link in the previous bullet point for more
Yeah.
information.
I think we can look at how we can tighten that up and how we can address it. I agree it's a lot for the facilitator to say, and to have the link in the bullet point would be hard to convey.
We put the link in the workbook, maybe?
Yeah, that is the link alive? Do we already have the link?
It will be in January.
Yeah,
It's, but not yet.
not completed yet.
Okay, yeah, I think we should put the link in the workbook. That would be a better use. And I assume it'll be promoted in will it be promoted in the communication to the monthly communication to regional leaders? The formerly communique, is that? I would also urge that we get rid of the DIGGE acronym and just call it the guide in that previous point.
Okay.
If people create an acronym, it's fine, but I think it's too long of an acronym to start with.
On a different question, it's always one of my things. I was trying to look at if either of the roles have a copy of their job description as they're answering these questions. Because we asked them about what skills or knowledge do you need, what do you see as the key tasks and purposes? And I don't know if they have that anywhere, or are they just, is that in the manual, or will they have that with them in the room, I guess, as they're trying to answer the questions?
Go ahead.
So their job description has been sent to them when they were offered the position. We sent them the code of policies and the manual. We recovered it in the onboarding calls. Not the full extent of it, but what is your job? We are not including it in here as it's been given to them so many times already. And we used to do an exercise where they reviewed it sitting in there, and it was very dry. You know, it's standard code of policies, things like that. Smyrna, we are not printing the addendum or the regional leaders manual this year, correct? Correct. So it'll be, but we will have a new resources and updated communication to them in February. Yes, February. So they will have received the job description at least 3 times before this.
I don't doubt they'll have it. I'm just saying, when they try to answer the questions, will they have the presence of mind to remember what you've already shared with them several times? That's all. So.
I mean, the hope is yes, they will remember that. But I guess looking to the room, what are your thoughts?
Would it be possible to include the regional leader manual in their materials when they register? I know you said you didn't want to print it.
I don't know if we will be able to print it. We'd have to. It is something that we would put on, it is already on like
Yeah.
Rotary's website, the code of policies. And the manual is also on the regional leaders page on rotary.org.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if that might be something we could add about, if you need a refresher. You can check on the website or wherever it's housed.
How long is the job description? Like, could it be an appendix in the workbook?
I think it could be. I would say it's less for the EMGAs. I think that we could take just the relevant excerpts of the code, and I think it would be somewhere around 1 page, 1 full page.
I'm just thinking of, is that better than trying to print the whole manual for each member, you know?
To me, that's the preferred route. I think we would want to look at it. Maybe looking at an excerpt from the manual because that's already translated
Right.
and copy edited versus the code, which is not. And kind of giving a minimum of what they could use to have the conversation versus everything.
Mhm. Maybe Smyrna and Renee and I can take a look at this and then come back to the group a little bit later today.
Any further questions regarding the key points or that review section at the end of the session? So that's on page 7 into 8. Yes, Yinka. Oh,
Yes, just looking at page 6, the one for the polio fundraising at the top, it says which ones, talks about events in your district that
Mhm.
have been successful. That question may make somebody just look inward to his or our district only. But many of these people have played roles in
Mhm.
the region before, so they know what is happening in some other districts.
Mhm.
So if we are talking about just bringing out best practices they've seen, I'm thinking if we leave this as your district, that information may not come out.
Just strategies and events that have been successful,
Yes. Or districts.
district events.
Yes,
Mhm.
yeah, maybe in your districts.
Things you've seen. Okay.
Do we want to say something like districts in your region?
Perfect.
Something like that, yes, thank you.
And it still has that regionalized approach. So
And I have a question about the final bullet before review on page 7, where it says, you're empowered to take initiative, encourage districts with their fundraising, and actively promote fundraising efforts locally in your district and regionally. I feel like we're setting them up a little bit for some conflict. Should they start by telling the why before they start the fundraising initiatives? Because I feel like sometimes it's just the give, and it's not the why. So is there an
emphasizing-
opportunity to massage that a little bit and get it to be a little bit more about you're empowered to talk about why giving to the foundation makes an impact and then take initiative on activities or something
More of
along those lines.
Okay, more of the focus on the end of it, the overall impact on the Rotary Foundation. the
Yeah.
front-
Well, in the
front
world,
end.
yeah, overall impact of what we're trying to do to make the world better, lives better. So that's where I think they get, it's that value proposition aspect.
Mhm. Great. Then at the bottom of page 7, the review, key point, beginning with the support that the manual can provide, followed by additional resources and staff that can support.
If you do decide to include an appendix with the, maybe you
Job
just
roles.
reference that here, that it's in their workbook.
And then this last section, the facilitators notes will be consistent at the end of each session, referring participants to the goal section that will be in their workbook appendix, answering final questions, reviewing learning objectives with the group, and reminding participants to fill out the relevant evaluations, which will be a session evaluation following each session. And that is our first session. Any final questions about this one or areas that we wanted to go back to before we move on to our next sessions?
I just want to compliment you on not overloading the session and giving time for them to talk. Well done.
Very nicely done.
It was definitely not just me. I worked very closely with a lot of staff, specifically Elizabeth Toms. I know she's not at this meeting, but she was at the planning meeting in August. And while she's not here right now, she did have a big, huge hand in the curriculum and our staff, some subject matter experts. So my hats off to them as well. As we move to the next section, so we're on session 2, page 1. And this session, as well as our next session, session 3, will be very similar, especially the leader's guide will be almost identical. And they're both focused on using reports and resources. They are just divided by role. So this first one that we're looking at is the endowment and major gifts advisors, leader's guides. And then workbook 2 is our endowment major gifts advisors workbook. This session will occur simultaneously with the EPNC session. It will be Monday in the morning. And the focus in the learning objectives will be on reports and resources available, how they can really use those things and learn about some of the reports that are available if they are not familiar, and then find those things, work through the process of using my Rotary, Rotary Club Central, and really kind of doing a scavenger hunt. In our introduction, it'll be a little bit, oh, yeah, please, yes.
Yeah, maybe I'm a bit too early, but
No.
we talked about it before, that if you want to access the resources, you only can do it by district and not by region.
Mhm.
And they would look into it if that would be possible also for the EMGIAs
Mhm.
to do it by region, because otherwise you have to click back and go forward. So is there any thing in process or?
Thanks, Lise. We are looking into that. Unfortunately, it is still in development with our IT team. It has not yet been created, but it is in progress, this request.
Thank you, Christine.
Yeah, and the only way to work around it is to download all of the districts and then you can put them into one document, which is not great, but we need an Excel class is what we should have. Yes. So, and part of the challenge is because the regions are different than the zones. And so there's lots of different configurations and our system is just very complex and that makes it very challenging to do that. So it's not for lack of effort. It's just practically, it's very challenging to do that.
Something else that is important to know about these 2 sessions is that they'll be staff facilitated. So that will be a little bit different than the rest of them, which will be facilitated by our facilitators. So in the introductions on page 1, session 2, participants will arrive and they'll be asked to go to My Rotary, likely with their own devices. Then moving to page 2, the staff facilitator will welcome the participants, review the learning objectives, and go through a few key points that are really designed to help orient the participants, understand the purpose of the session for locating certain reports and resources, and talk about the self-guided aspect of the session. So it's not something that the entire group is moving through together as one. The participants really have the opportunity to zone in to certain reports or certain scenarios that maybe are more difficult, skip certain scenarios for a later time, and then also have the resource to refer back to, throughout the session, throughout their time as regional leader. This next section on page 3, the online tools and resources practice asks the facilitator to refer the participants to their workbook scenarios. So in the workbook, Yes, Inka?
I can't immediately remember for this session whether that was one of the smaller groups or the whole group together.
This one is divided by role. So it'll be just EMGAs in the room or just EPNCs in the room. And all together, yes.
So I imagine in situations like this, you will find 2, 3, 4 people struggling to get into my Rotary. And if we don't handle it immediately, you may lose a lot of time. So how do we plan to cater for that?
I can start. So one thing is during this session, we are going to have quite a few staff in the room. So not just the staff facilitator, we'll have quite a few other staff kind of walking around, seeing if anyone needs help. The other thing that we're going to do that Renee's team manages during registration is asking them to log in. Do you still do that?
With everybody bringing their own devices, most people have auto-saved their passwords. So we can have them pull out their device at registration, check and make sure. Probably have to teach them how to set up the internet or something like that, log on to the Wi-Fi. But we'll make sure that they can get into my Rotary during registration. So that way in the session, when they're using their device, they should be good to go.
And for the staff that will be in the room, would there be a language mix?
So we'll have interpreters sitting in the interpreting, and then the staff that are walking around will be a mix of people. Most of them will be subject matter experts related to the reports. And then if there is if let's say the staff person who's an expert on reports doesn't speak the language of the participant, we'll have the interpreter help them explain it.
I have a question on the key points on page 2. Would it be appropriate in here somewhere to mention the confidentiality of some of the reports as far as, who? Yes. I mean, I would assume
Right.
most of them understand that you don't just share these with anybody and everybody, but
Right, and
might make sense to mention.
we have like more of a minor key point, talking about the reports being for Rotary purposes only, not necessarily emphasizing the confidentiality, but like you were saying, hoping that there's that awareness that it's not to be shared with everyone. You're kind of using these reports for very specific reasons and then sharing them with individuals for very specific reasons, not just doing like a blast email or anything like that.
Yeah, we do get questions a lot about, like with the monthly major gift report, what they can
Mhm.
share off of that. Although it comes with a cover sheet, people don't really understand what that means. And
Right.
so you can share it for a Rotary purpose, like to encourage the districts to do thank yous like that. So there's some of the nuances like that that are helpful.
Is the privacy policy linked somewhere or in the resources otherwise?
It's in
Printed
the
on
learning
bottom of the
plan.
reports.
So we can reference that.
I do think it might be good to expand that point about for Rotary purposes, to say that, some of this is confidential information and, we could reference the course that they were supposed to have taken.
Good point.
Protecting personal data is its name. I just looked it up.
Thanks. So in the workbook, so I'm on page 1, the online resources and reports scenario section kind of mirrors the key point section where there's instructions for the participants, the different resources that they will use, My Rotary Learning Center, Rotary Club Central, and the Regional Leaders Library, which is a shared library for the leaders. And then there will also be a reports and resources guide. So that is a listing of all the reports that will be available to that role, and that will be in the workbook appendix. So it won't be a lot of extensive information about the reports, but it will have a listing of their names. Yep.
Just to maybe calm anybody who may be panicky.
Yeah.
Is it appropriate to put somewhere in here that the computer lab will be an opportunity to further practice? So that the guys see that, say, okay, oh, thank God, I can still do that tomorrow afternoon or later during the day.
Right, and at the top of page 3 in the leader's guide, we try to emphasize that it's okay if you don't complete the activities. It's not something that everything needs to be completed 100%. They can skip around. They can spend, a lot of time on one of the scenarios in particular, if that's really the one that is applicable. And it's really to address those different skill levels and different needs. Some participants won't need any staff, help, but other participants might need a lot of staff help with some of the logistics. So it could be an opportunity to add a little bit more of that, it's okay, relax, you don't have to stress about the reports.
When
It's
I
a learning
recall in the
opportunity.
past, having been a participant,
Mhm.
that the staff was really good about wandering the room and making, one-on-one questions with people. Are you
Mhm.
having any difficulty? And I thought that's very helpful.
Mhm. Right, just that awareness that help is there, support's there.
Will there be an expectation, like on the EMGAs, for example, that the staff partners will be participating, or do we make it clear that they won't be participating somewhere?
Don't think there'll be the expectation, no.
They said they'll be working with them and then they'll be in one session with them and the next, in one session they won't be with them. So I was just clarifying that.
Yeah, in the past, we have said that the staff partners don't have to be involved, but I would look to the two of you. If you would like them to be involved, we can look into that. But I think in the past, they have said that they did not want to attend.
I think maybe as needed, and to Yinka's point, if someone's not feeling comfortable or if there's a language issue, obviously we'll have a translation, but if, I would say our team would be available, but as needed.
Do the EMGAs have access to all of the reports that the staff partners have access to, or does the staff have access to some things similar to yeah?
Unfortunately, no, Chris.
We have access to a lot of data, but not, most of it we can't share.
Right.
And so those can be challenging discussions sometimes about why I can't share this with you.
Right.
So the reports that they have access to should be sufficient for their role. Sometimes there are other reports that we can run that get a little bit closer, but we try to do that more on a case-by-case basis instead of getting into discussion about why there's different access to different things.
So everything that we have taken a look at so far will again be very similar between the EMGA and the EPNC Leaders Guide. We're about to get into the scenarios, and that's where it will diverge a little bit. So in our workbook, page 2, we're looking at the first scenario, identifying prospects. And the scenario really asks the participants to kind of locate various resources. There's more than one place to find the information that they may need to support major donors or find information about major donors. Look at that first scenario. Are there any questions? Move to our second scenario, cultivation events. So again, similar format. What are some of the various resources that are available? Where can you find that information? And where are the multiple places you can find that information? Scenario 3 is focused on stewardship. what information in the resource can help with identifying major donors. How can you follow up communication? And how does the resource or report help you understand the giving activity and trends in your region? Scenario 4, working with district endowment major gifts subcommittees. Yeah, Lise.
I have a question here. You know, the Netherlands is very small.
Mhm.
And it's even a challenge to get a foundation chair in the districts. So it's very hard to have someone in this position.
In this role.
So it's not so common to have this in our country. So how can we say it in another way? Maybe if you are not able to have a subcommittee. Because then the question will be, well, I don't have, so I will skip this one.
I won't do that one. We're at scenario 4, page 4. Working with district endowment major gift subcommittees.
I mean, to that point, I think, you know, culturally, we're gonna find different scenarios
Mhm.
throughout the world, but I think we still want to encourage them to have these roles. So I think including it in here gives those people, and I don't even know if the incoming EMGA will be here from that region. Okay. But I think it gives them something to think about, whether or not it is present in some of the districts they're working with. It's something that they should be thinking about.
Right, in kind of to that point in the first section of the scenario, it's talking about if someone is not appointed, you know, what's the step, what are the steps, what's the process? Kind of building that awareness of the role and why someone should be in that role, why it's significant.
I totally agree that we need the people because it makes your job very much easier. So that's okay. On the other hand, being an EMGA, I know it's very difficult to find someone. So yeah, but I'm totally agree on that it should be in the workbook, but for some it will be like, okay, I'll skip this one.
Which report is this one supposed to be pointing to?
District leaders, I think, because it says, where will you look to find information about current assistant governors and district officers to determine candidates? So there's a report where you can, access.
I believe it's like current and incoming officers list.
So would we want to add the exact name of that report into the materials so everyone is clear?
Well, we don't do that for the other ones, but I'm
Mhm.
wondering if that may be in the leader's guide notes as, right, because some of these, it may be a little bit
We will have.
not as clear which report or which resource we're supposed to be looking at.
Right, and kind of to that point, there will be the reports and resources guide listing all the reports names, so that participants can refer to that in their workbook appendix.
And remember that this is a staff expert that's leading this session, so they should know this as well.
So kind of to clarify, if I am an attendee, once we say, okay, get started, I'm working with a partner and we're reading the scenario. Am I supposed to write anything in the white box between the two blue boxes?
Yes, you could write the resources and then list those in the next section. So calling out the specific resources once you kind of come up with a list.
So do we say something like, for that scenario one, list where you will look to find the information about identifying prospects? Do we give a little bit more direction there?
Mhm.
And then maybe say, instead of which resources, include resources and reports that provide information you need to locate information about prospects in your region.
Okay.
And then are they supposed to then, when it says resource one, what is the resource? They list that resource there from
Correct.
above that they wrote.
Right.
What information in this resource can help you identify potential donors? So are they supposed to come up with 3 resources or reports for this scenario?
Correct.
Do we need to list it like, can all of them help me identify potential donors? Or should it be like, which one will help you identify potential donors?
Mhm.
I guess I'm a little bit confused. If I was running this myself, I wonder if we want to do a little bit of offline walk through it.
Kind of reworking it for the list and then maybe just the questions in the following spaces.
That's what I'm kind of wondering, because I think what
Yeah.
I'd want to do is flip to that list, be like prospective donors, prospective donors. What's going to help me with prospective donors? Kind of going through that. So it's almost like you'd have the question and then, oh, I found these 3 things that'll help me with prospective donors. And then you're looking at the questions.
Okay. Noted.
On a related note, are we anticipating participants in these sessions would be using digital versions of the workbook? Or only printed?
How's envisioning printed?
Mhm. Okay. If someone asks for the digital version that they want to be following along with, are we accommodating that during the live event? I'm just,
If someone,
yeah,
they want everything on their computer and have digital versions of the workbook along with the guides and the reports and everything.
I mean, if we can certainly look at that if we think that that's a priority. As we mentioned, we will be giving everyone a printed book. That's sort of the expectation, the default. But, you know, we can certainly make a digital copy available.
Are there any issues with sharing a Word version of it so they can type in versus a PDF that we usually share?
I think the idea was to have kind of everything in their workbook, like from all the sessions, their hard copy workbook.
What we've done in the past is an interactive PDF. So the workbook is designed, so we can't do a Word version of it because it doesn't exist. But if this was a priority, we could look at making an interactive PDF. It does take additional work from our production team, so we'd have to see about capacity. But we could explore that if needed.
okay. And I'm not encouraging that. I just wanted to ask the question because I was trying to envision if there is a participant who's only using digital copies of things. I'm wondering how some of the prompts in this session would work for them as a participant. related to certain reports or where they find things?
Yeah, I would say we can make a decision as a leadership group, but if we're not offering it as a digital workbook, then they will be using the printed workbook.
Okay, before we go on to the discussion part of the session, do we want to look at any of the scenarios again? Revisit any of the questions? I know we are going to discuss kind of the format. Okay. So in our leaders guide for this session, so that's page 3 in your binder. The facilitator will close out the scenario section and refer participants to their discussion questions. That's in your workbook, page 5. That's the last section of the workbook. Participants will be able to work together to kind of go through these closing questions about the decisions that they made to choose certain reports, the information they found in the reports, things that they're excited to do now that they have these tools and kind of have these resources, and then promoting the resources. Any questions or comments about the discussion section of the session?
So there will be interpreters, so if people are paired that don't speak the same language, there'll be interpreter to help with the discussion? Okay,
Correct. Okay. Any final questions or comments about this section, excuse me, this session? Again, the next session that we go through will be very similar.
A logistic question.
Yep.
Do I assume that in the final print, this space will be bigger?
Yeah, that is very good to know, Yinka. Yes, the spaces in the workbook have been abbreviated just for space saving in the printing. So the actual workbooks will have plenty of space for writing. That's a very good note. Hearing nothing else, I think we're ready to move on to the next one, which will be again the using reports and resources session now for End Polio Now coordinators. On session 3, page 1 in my leader's guide, workbook 3, page 1 in my workbook. The session will also be staff facilitated for the EPNCs, will occur at the same time frame as the EMGA session. The learning objectives are the same, so determining which reports are available and how they can help you, locating those reports and understanding how to use them. Move to the next page in the leader's guide, page 2. Introduction will be the same, asking participants to log into my Rotary, welcoming the participants, going through the learning objectives, and then going through the same key points as in the EMGA session, talking about using these as guides and strategies to be successful in the role, really identifying, cultivating, and stewarding donors to reach polio fundraising goals, specifically for EPNCs. Talking about there might already be a familiarity with some reports, but the session is designed to be able to explore new ones or new ways to use the reports and resources. An emphasis on the confidentiality or using the reports for Rotary purposes, which we can add that same note from our EMGA session. Actually. And I'll add that same note from the EMGA session about adding more about the privacy. The next key point, discussing the self-guided nature of the activities, that there are staff in the room to help. There'll be interpreters in the room, just like in the EMGA session, and it's okay to move through the scenarios at their own pace. You don't have to complete everything. In the workbook, and I'm on page 1 of the workbook. It follows the same format with logging into my Rotary, instructions about what will be available and the tools, My Rotary Learning Center, Rotary Club Central, and for EPNC's polioeradication.org. The EPNCs don't actually have access to the regional leader library that the EMGs and other roles have. Turning to page 2 in the workbook and 2 in the leader's guide. 3 in the leader's guide. The scenarios. So scenario 1 for EPNCs begins with giving a Polio Plus presentation. So locating resources in order to be able to build out that presentation, find the information that's needed. I'll make the same note for this session as we did in the last session about formatting. Kind of reworking some of the where we're asking for the resource, where we're asking the question. Apart from-
So
go
I
ahead.
suppose we'll be changing the words here also, like we did for the EMGA, asking them to list.
You're correct. Yep. Looking at the formatting that we'll update for the EMGA session, matching that for the EPNC session. Apart from that, are there any questions about scenario 1? Okay. Going to page 3 in the workbook. Scenario 2, identifying Polio Plus giving. And again, asking for participants to list resources that may be available to help them with that information. And some kind of specialized questions about reports and resources that can help you support districts, recognize donors, talk about giving activity or certain patterns in the district.
Do you want to reference anywhere in here about Polio Plus Society, since there's an emphasis on starting that in all of the districts?
Certainly add that. Where it might fit best.
Madeline, I think we can rework the text a little bit because I
Okay.
think we got to that question. We just didn't call it out as a Polio Blood Society.
Okay.
Nearing $100, so we could just call it out.
And our next scenario, number 3, fundraising events, specifically highlighting Polio Day events. Moving to page 4 in the workbook, closing out that events scenario with questions about planning the fundraising events and event planning resources. And our final scenario for EPNCs will be DDF for polio. So familiarizing yourself with district DDF activity. Using certain resources and reports to identify key districts to work with. Planning follow-up communications.
One question.
Yeah.
Are they able to see what the DDF is in a district?
I believe so. A specific report.
Yeah. That's great.
Sorry. On their District Polio Plus report, it shows if they have given or not and what their 20% goal is. They also have access to the share reports on My Rotary as well, and Polio Now coordinators do.
My microphone wasn't on for that last section. Apologies, virtual attendees. But I went through the discussion question section. I'll pause here for any questions about that section or about this session overall. And then-
I just.
Yeah.
Had a question I was asking Claire, so I'm gonna bring it up to the group. Scenario 4 about DDF portfolio. I was just wondering with all the acronyms, is there any value in actually spelling out district designated
Designated.
fund on the first mention and then use DDF?
Yeah, good point in the title of the scenario.
And the first sentence says district DDF and the first D actually is district.
I think you could leave the title DDF, but in that first reference, say district designated funds. Good point.
Thank you. Excuse me. Okay, our next workbook and leaders guide section is number 4. So page 1 in the leaders guide, page 1 in the workbook. This session will be for both roles, take place on Monday in the afternoon. Our learning objective focuses on how you'll work with others in your region. Pretty open. Moving to page 4 in the page 2 in the leader's guide. Our introduction. The facilitator will welcome the participants and review the learning objective. We'll start with a discussion question asking about raising major gifts. Why you think it will be helpful to work with a team. In the next section of the leader's guide, working together on page 2, we begin with key points, who you'll work with, and how it will help you achieve goals and strengthen our foundation. Here, the facilitator will refer participants to the workbook. So page 1 in the workbook, who you'll work with, and the facilitator will ask participants to work in small groups to write how they can work with the people listed on the far left column. Different roles, different ways of working with those individuals.
Madeline?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay.
So they will be, you guys will just assign them to groups ahead of time. Will you have the EMGAs and EPNCs mixed in the groups, or will you keep them separate?
I thought mixed, yeah.
Okay.
Mhm. Then you'll see on page 3 in the leader's guide, we have the facilitator bringing the group back, and there are sample responses for kind of the discussion following the scenario. Then this session, I did want to call out, I know Yinka, you had the point yesterday of talking about working with district governors specifically, in addition to kind of the district leaders. And I wanted to check in with you and with the group about the inclusion of district governors in this session. Hi. Oh, for the catering, yes. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And see if we want to open discussion about including that or how it's already included in some ways in some of the discussion.
I'm sorry, can you rephrase your
Yeah.
question?
Yeah. yesterday, Yinka had brought up the inclusion of specifically district governors being mentioned. We, of course, talk about working with a lot of different roles. We talk about district leaders, but maybe calling out specifically district governors and district governor line. Kind of taking advantage of the right people. You feel comfortable with this? Okay.
We have the district line called out
Mhm.
in the workbook on that fourth line there.
I would just say in the the fifth one down, if we do determine that that district fundraising chair position is one of the required positions, maybe just including that.
Okay.
I know that the foundation chair does a lot of fundraising, but I always encourage districts to have that, a person in that fundraising role.
And there's going to be some messaging going out in the next few months highlighting to district governors and elects the importance of trying to fill that role. So.
And I think the fundraising chairs are meant to raise funds for the annual fund specifically. Specifically, which is not part of what the EMGAs are doing. A question for Claire. Is it of any value, including the national polio chairs?
That only would, is only relevant to those who are in a country that has a national polio plus chair. So for the upcoming training, there would be two that would have a national polio plus chair. The EPNC coming from Pakistan and the EPNC coming from Cote d'Ivoire. We also did not include in here the National Advocacy Advisor, because that pertains to those in Europe and donor countries, but not to everyone. So we tried to keep it to the positions that would be with relevant to all end polio now coordinators, but we could put in a statement about and other polio chairs within your country so that it would cover the national advocacy advisors and countries with a national advocacy advisor. And it would also cover those with a national polio plus chair and country. If we wanted to do a general polio committee call out for positions to work with.
Just in case anybody cares, because I now have this information. I love technology. So I just sent a chat to my team in the US and Canada. And the consensus is very much that in the US, the district fundraising chairs are almost always the DRFC. So that's kind of it. They don't have a separate person in that role. They do occasionally, but the vast majority of the time it's the same person. And then they may have under them like an annual fund chair or an endowment fund chair or something like that, but they don't have, at least in this context, a separate district fundraising chair.
Used to be they were supposed.
Yes.
It was one of the required roles. I didn't know if it's still.
I think somebody said, they usually fill it with somebody already in another role. So whether it's required or not, they're putting a person in it, but it's often the same person they're already working with. So I just thought that might be of use for the.
And I think annual fund chairs are no longer one of those ones they have to appoint. I think that's the name that changed to fundraising chairs, I think.
So back when we looked at it, it was simplified because we found so many repeat appointments, but then it kept getting added back in. So we tried to simplify it to avoid it, but then everybody wanted these specialty roles, so they got added back in. So I think we are back in that same situation.
Back to the polio issue. What does everybody think about that? Is it confused? So if we say something general about like, and other polio positions, based on your country, is that confusing to people who don't have that? And they're like, what is that? Should I have that? Or do you think it's okay to mention? The other kind of follow-up question is those that have a country-specific polio position, I guess I would assume they already know about it and they're having communications about that position or person. What do you think, Claire?
So Maria Wren held that position, so she would be well aware of it. And I believe Sajid, if I'm saying his name correctly, the incoming EPNC from Pakistan, is part of the National Polio Plus Committee for Pakistan, so they are definitely aware of their dual role. For those who EPNCs coming from Europe, my guess is they would be aware of their national advocacy advisor. In the US, that's a little bit, I wouldn't know if they would know that committee. And US requests for advocacy are on an ad hoc basis when needed. And then the EPNCs are brought in when there's a need for them to work on advocacy, because that's much more regionalized than country.
Sounds to me like it could create some confusion, like you said, but I think I would defer to Claire.
If they won't need to really work with them, then we don't bother. But my experience is that they need to work with them. And sometimes you have a lot of conflict in there. I've seen the attempt to match the two roles of recent, but there's only one EPNC. So the best that can happen is he or she is also the national chair for his or her country. But the other countries in the zone or in the district, they have the national polio chairs, completely different from the district polio chair. So if I take a district, say, let's say the district that Maria Ring comes from, 9101 or 9102, they will have something like 5 countries with national polio chairs. They will still have one district polio chair because it's a multi-country district, and then you have one EPNZ. So in a country where the national polio chair exists and there's no district, and the district polio chair is present somewhere else, and the EPNC is somewhere else, then the only resource available in that country is the national polio chair. And they need to find a way of working with them.
I think
So
we could
we do-
include them same as the area of focus, major gift advisors underneath as a list them out. And if it applies, it applies. If it doesn't,
A question about the EMGAs. Do they also work in conjunction with raising money for the peace centers, or is that totally separate? I know there's a separate committee.
They raise money for the endowment, which one of the endowment giving options is for the peace centers. So
Along similar lines as what Claire just referenced, I'm wondering if we could shift the order in this list. I think it's great that we're erring on the side of being inclusive and listing a lot of different positions that both of these roles can work with. But I think some of them, like we list right at the top, the EMGA's Fund Development Staff Partner, maybe we move that to the bottom because it's not relevant for all of the participants. Whereas I'd say like the predecessor, everyone has a predecessor, right, that we're trying to encourage them to work with. Maybe we move that closer to the top.
Yeah, I can look at reordering, Christine. So picking back up with the session, key points in the leader's guide on page 3. So it's following the scenario that we were talking about, activity. Talks about developing relationship with staff, district leaders, senior leaders, and other regional leaders. Moving to the next page, page 4 in the leader's guide. Working with many people, but as we've talked about yesterday, really determining the best person or group to work with on given projects or tasks. Move to a discussion question, similarities and differences between the RRFC role, and then the italicized text are sample answers. The next section in the Leader's Guide on page 4, supporting districts, we begin with a discussion question about working with EMGAs or EPNCs or other regional leaders when you were a district leader. Kind of preferences for that relationship, for the leadership style. That discussion point moves then to key points from the facilitator, talking about how goals are unified, working together to be successful, and that you can be in your role a resource, coach, and mentor to district leaders. We then move to another discussion question on page 5 of the Leader's Guide, balancing working with districts, supporting them, and achieving your goals in your role. Then the next blue box coincides with another.
Quick question.
Oh, yep, Chris.
Strike the balance. Is that a phrase that
Too
will be
colloquial.
common in all languages that people would understand what that means?
We work to balance supporting and district leaders and achieving your goal instead of strike the balance.
Could you just say, how can you work with districts to support them and help achieve their goals or something like that?
Right?
Or how can you work with district leaders to support them and help achieve their goals?
I think the issue here is that sometimes the district goals may not be in alignment with the EMGA's goal.
Mhm.
So there needs to be a balance. Should you just support them to achieve theirs and then you have yours unmet?
Mhm.
Or do you have to find a way of
Balancing the
balancing
two.
it? So you achieve yours and still get them to meet theirs.
Support district leaders while also working to achieve your goals. Something like that. And there you go. Everybody's goals. Yep, I can
I'm
continue
sure
to
you can
work
figure
it
out a way.
now that
to-
I understand
yeah.
the intent.
Concerned about the
Yeah.
strike the balance and whether or not
Right.
people would understand what that meant.
So again, on workbook, or excuse me, Leader's Guide, page 5, on the facilitator will refer participants to their section, working with districts and their activity. Talking about learning what district's goals and needs are, aligning that with your strengths, knowledge, and skills. Working with district leaders whose preferred approach, goals, or priorities might differ, so managing those relationships. Collaborating with your predecessor, and then working with districts to help you achieve your goals. Are there any questions from the room, from our virtual participants about the activity or about the preceding discussion points?
So
Jory?
in prior years, this turns into a very robust discussion of why won't the governors let me do X, Y, and Z? So we might want to have something in the leader's guide to kind of prepare for when that discussion comes up. You know, if governors are prioritizing annual fund or prioritizing polio, how do you convince a district to care about the endowment? It's an important question, and there are ways to do it, but there might be just maybe prep for the leader's note about, turn back to the room, like, how do you do that? I think that's been an easier discussion when we've had the first years in the room, because they can talk about how they've done that. But just since it comes up most years, we might want to have some way of being prepared for that, so the leaders aren't caught unawares. Yeah, the facilitators, yes, thank you.
I can make a note for the facilitator orientation as well when we practice this session to kind of talk through that a little bit and how strategies to handle it.
Again, I'm gonna go back to them being able to articulate the why is gonna be really critical anytime that question comes up. Because if you can't tell a district leader why, of course, they're not going to prioritize what you're asking them to.
Thank you. And then this section, go ahead, Lise, yeah.
What I've seen is that most district governors doesn't know the endowment fund. So you have to explain it first, and then they will be interested in to have it as a priority. So there is a reasonable task for an incoming EMGA to make endowment in in place. So it was actually doing by presentations and showing what it could be. And then there was a world open for them. Then they would share it. So it's storytelling and showing what it is.
I think it's a good point too, because it's a 3-year role. And so sometimes that first role is education. That's a big part of it.
So thinking about Sarah's comment about the why, and then Lee's comment that you just made, I'm looking at the leader's guide on page 4-5. The last question before the review, how can you use your strengths, knowledge, and skills to support district leaders?
Yep.
Could we reframe that a little bit so it's more about the why, or how can you partner or collaborate with district leaders, toward achieving your goals? Earlier in the session, we had a really nice key point about working on a team will help you be more successful in raising major gifts.
Do you
I
want to
wonder-
include in here something about use your strengths, knowledge, and skills to educate and support district leaders? Maybe somewhere include something about educating them about.
Or raising
Raising awareness.
awareness.
Yeah.
Yes, awareness, because educating in the Netherlands will be dictating someone
Right.
what to do. So that would be a challenge. So inspire them and
Right.
inform them. Yeah.
Thanks, Christine.
I kind of like something like inspire and support district leaders, because I definitely want that idea that district leaders feel they're driving things, not being told what to do.
Right. Okay, then that takes, oh, Jessica.
I'm looking at the workbook 402, working with districts.
Yes.
I'm looking at the questions here. At what point do we think an EMGA who has a perception that I'm a boss of the governor? I'm a PDG, I'm a regional officer, so the governor is below me, which is not true, but many
Yeah.
of them have that perception. At what point on this do you think they may come to the conclusion that, okay, wait a minute, I'm not a boss after all. I'm an enabler. At what point will somebody with that kind of perception sit down and say,
That's a good point. Hopefully, through the discussion questions preceding this, if this is the last part of the activity, are there particular questions in this activity that you'd like to rework or take another look at? Kind of help those participants.
And they're not all PDGs.
Right.
Because you don't have to be a PDG to become a regional leader. So just something to keep in mind.
I also think that might be a good part of, Chris, your opening general session presentation, is kind of presenting the whole concept of they're not above governors-elect, right? And they cannot tell governors-elect what to do. They can help support and guide. And that's the goal, that we talk about it from there, that it really should be a collaboration and a partnership. And that inspire. I loved, Lise, when you said inspire. I thought that was wonderful.
Yeah, what I always tell in the beginning that with the DGs or the DGEs, you're my ears and eyes. So I will trigger them to be my ears and eyes. So they will help me. And that will be more comfortable for them to share information, to get potential donors.
I would like them to feel they will help you so that you can really help them.
Yeah.
You know, that is the message they need to get. I mean, I recall we finished the meeting and we said the regional officers should go back to their districts and invite their governors-elect to some kind of tea or a drink and have some discussion, you know. And I think the RRFC or somebody like that reached out to the governor. The governor said, oh, on this day, I am in so city. If you can meet us there, that will be fine. I know the regional officer came out to say, what the heck? I'm telling him where I want to meet him. He's telling me to meet him somewhere else. Who does he think he is? You know, I mean, maybe that is not common. Maybe that is not common, but I just want a situation where whoever comes to this session with that kind of impression leaves thinking different.
Is that something too to think about for the general session prior to the breakout that's focused on building teams, teamwork, best practices? You're going to be a speaker for that, Yinka. That does bring us to the review section. So on page 5 of the leader's guide, we end with a few key points about working with particular staff, communication skills, and the importance of developing that, using that to help cultivate major gifts. And then we end with our common section, referring participants to the goals section, answering final questions, reviewing learning objectives, referring to the evaluation. Are there any final questions about this session, about the Leader's Guide workbook from those in the room or our virtual participants?
Madeline, could you add a comment at the end on the key points? So Yinka's that working together with the district governor, you both will be successful. Like it's a partnership, like you're not their boss, like you're not their boss, but like this is a partnership. You scratch my back, I scratch your back. We're both successful. That's sort of one of their takeaways as they leave.
Make a note as well.
You know, my sense is that once the governor believes that the regional leader is focused on our success, the whole dynamics changes. You know, it is the regional leader getting that message to the governor to say, I want you to be successful. You know, I mean, in my part of the world, for example, most of our donors don't really care whether we put money in endowment, in this or that. A lot of them just say, okay, we like what Rotary does, so take this $25,000. So the districts do the allocation sometimes. Okay, put 10,000 in polio, depending on their priority, or put this here. You know, and I've seen situations where I've called the governor to say, wait a minute, there is some kind of recognition at the end of the year. If you have 0 here, you miss that recognition. So put this here, put that. I said, oh, thank you, I like that. So every other donor that comes, she calls me and says, I have this amount, how should I put it? You know, so I've become somebody she comes to for help. You know, and that's where every regional leader should find themselves, I think.
I think a good point, Inka. I think we're at our break time. So after the 30-minute break, come back around 10:40. Thank you, everyone. We'll pick up with curriculum after a break.
All right, are we ready to continue with our curriculum review? All right, thanks. Madeline, take us away.
Okay. Welcome back, everybody. We are going to pick up with the leading change session. So that is session 5, page 1 in the leader's guide, and workbook 5, page 1 in the workbook. So leading change session, as everyone gets reoriented, is a session for all participants. They'll be mixed. It will be on Monday in the afternoon on the 27th of March. Learning objectives focus on understanding your role, implementing change in Rotary, and being able to use Rotary's change model to plan for change. Then if we flip the page to the first page, of content in the Leader's Guide, so that's page 2. Our introduction begins again with a welcome and review of the learning objectives. On page 2, we then move to our change in Rotary section and begin with a discussion question, asking what kinds of change in Rotary or our foundation you anticipate needing to address during your term as a regional leader. Key points from the facilitator follow, talking about kind of growing and improving, focused on innovation, change management, the need for all regional leaders to be involved in the process of implementing change, and understanding and implementing Rotary's approach to change specifically. And before I go to the workbook, I wanted to pause for any questions in the room or our virtual attendees.
Thanks,
I don't
Madeline.
want-
Yeah, Christine?
Just a quick question, and this may just be semantics. At the bottom of, I'm sorry, on Leader's Guide, page 5-2, the change in Rotary section, that first key point to keep growing and improving,
Yes.
that it talks there about members, which I think makes sense broadly, but for these two groups, I'm wondering if we would want to also use the word donors to make it a little bit more specific to their role.
Members and donors, or just change to donors?
I'd look to the group.
Members, donors, and communities we serve.
Or could you just say donors?
They are.
Just say, allow us to meet the changing needs of our donors and the communities
Period.
we serve. We really want all members to be donors.
Yeah. It's an inclusive term.
Right. I was also going to ask if it would be appropriate somewhere in these bullet points to reference, as a regional leader, how important it is to embrace the changes of our organization or something like that.
Mhm. That you're not just implementing it, you are kind of embodying it.
I mean, regional leaders might not always agree with the changes that are happening, but they still need to embrace them and guide our districts and our donors through that process.
On Leader's Guide, page 3, we're moving to our first activity, which is Rotary's approach to change in the workbook. We're still on page 1 in the workbook. So participants will be asked to review Rotary's approach to change. That's what we see first. Then as you turn the page in the workbook, there's a question, what is your role as a regional leader in implementing change at Rotary? And there'll be more space to take notes. After the activity, we move to a discussion question. Why is it important for you to understand your role in helping implement change in Rotary? And then key points, helping donors, district leaders, and members understand and implement new Rotary initiatives, fielding questions about what's happening at Rotary, and helping bring about change by listening to what people are saying, paying attention to what's going on in different regions with different cultures, how they might view the changes. Okay. Moving to, yep, Inka.
There is a possibility that when you say change, most people will be thinking from the governance or structural changes.
Mhm.
Whereas for this group, the change may be different. Is it appropriate to, should I say, give instances of some changes that are going on? I mean, something that comes to my mind, for example, is, and it may not be appropriate to this group, is when we change the funding model. Donors who are used to I want to give you 10,000, I give you 10,000. We're now saying you need to give us 10,500. You know, that is a change that may confuse donors. So do we have examples of change that may be appropriate to this group? For example, for the EPNZ, there was a time the match was the match from the World Fund for donations were 1-to-1. Then it changed to something, you know, things like that. Otherwise, they will just sit there and be thinking of the future of Rotary. If you understand what I mean.
That, you make a good point, Inka. We, on page 2 in the Leader's Guide, we had started out with the kinds of change in Rotary or our foundation you anticipate needing to address. So that will hopefully build in that discussion. We could also incorporate sample responses as we've done in other questions. So that if there's something that's not touched upon in the discussion by the participants, the facilitator knows to bring it into the conversation if appropriate for the room. We're back on page 4 in the Leader's Guide, on page 2 in the workbook. We're in the section Become Change Ready, and our key point starts with using the change model. Then the facilitator refers participants to the next workbook section, Planning a Change. Asks participants to complete the activities. They'll be assigned into groups that are predetermined. In the workbook, we take a look at the activity briefly. We start with a scenario, and there's an emphasis on change relating to DE&I and how the change model might support kind of managing that change or discussing the change.
For a point of clarification, in the facilitator's notes on page 4, it says ask participants to read the instructions and complete the activity. So it looks to me that they're supposed to complete the activity individually and then they get into groups to discuss. Is that correct? Or do they complete it as a group?
They will complete it as the group. So we can change the wording around so that there's a little bit more clarity in.
That's what I was going to suggest, because I wasn't sure when I read it, do they complete it individually and then get to a group, or do they complete it as a group? So, thank you.
So again, as we move through the scenario, it mirrors the change model, and there are particular prompts for each section of the change model. Then as we move through that progression, the last part of the activity is writing a response to the prospective donor. I'm going to pause for any questions about the activity from anyone in the room, virtual participants. Okay, great. We will close out the activity with key points from the facilitator, talking about challenging resistance or questions about the organization, how there may be resistance, but it's not necessarily a rejection of change. Oh yeah, Inka.
I'm just, again, this scenario, and it's a DEI scenario we asked them to work on, which is fine. Can we find a scenario that is really directly relevant on their roles? Directly relevant, that they are likely to come across. It is, so it helps the learning thing, otherwise it will just be abstract.
In the scenario, they're working with a prospective donor, and that donor is expressing concerns about the importance placed on DE&I. I think kind of in the development of the scenario, we were trying to emphasize the incorporation of DEI into more than just the DE&I session, and that it's something that will come up in a lot of different topics. and in communication. Michelle, want to share a little bit more?
And I think, I mean, DE&I is an example of something that a donor could find controversial, right? You're going to encounter that working with donors. They don't like some policy at Rotary or the Rotary Foundation. They're concerned about something. And so, as Madeline said, we want to bring in DE&I to showcase that it is more than just, you know, about membership. This is something that all of us need to think about. But I think we can also think about it as, you know, there's going to be things that donors don't like about Rotary or the policies. How do you overcome that? How do you manage it? How do you talk them through it?
I think too, kind of building on what Michelle was saying, that it is something that might be more controversial, might be more challenging for them to manage in their role. So being able to work through with this group, with peers around them, and really talk through how they could explore that situation and work with those individuals, might give them ideas and kind of the support that they need going into the role. But I welcome anyone else comments about the
And I
scenario.
know that we are probably trying to use the same scenario for all the groups, including the group coming in the week after. But I mean, this scenario with the Rotary
For-
coordinators and co,
It's a mixed session, so that part of it too is that it's not role specific, so it's not something that can be specifically. Yeah,
no, I know, but I'm saying that we have this also for the global support team that is coming. It's the same scenario,
okay,
you know.
it is.
Yes, and I think this is more appropriate to them. It's the kind of thing they will encounter. But for the philanthropy group, it looks so remote. I mean, let's think about another scenario. I mean, just think about it, another scenario that they are likely to encounter. So for example, one that comes to my mind easily now is, we had Polaris Society, Polio Plus Society. What is all this? You know, why should I belong to Polaris Society and Polio Plus Society? And, you know, that is a change that is happening at this moment that we're encouraging them to go out and do something about, you know? So, I mean, I just give it as an example, but you see many more of these things, I think.
When I think thinking about a global situation, you know, it is definitely relevant. You know, we worked with subject matter experts on the scenarios, and we have heard that there are donors upset about DEI, which is why we called it out as a specific case study. Certainly, if there's something else that you all, like this group thinks is more globally relevant, we can work on that. But yeah, that's part of the reason why we incorporate that is this is something that we're encountering right now and trying to anticipate donors being upset about something. So if it's not DEI, if we think that that's too far-fetched for the global group, you know, thinking about something that is more global to kind of fit in here is okay. We can talk through that scenario.
Yeah, please.
You say actually that there are some examples from the past. So can we use then an example, for instance, in the case as a scenario? Or did I misunderstand you?
I think, well, Michelle had shared, we had worked with the subject matter experts and heard specifically about challenges with prospective donors about this topic. I was looking to the GSS session and they are very similar, but we tried to emphasize the working with donors in this session just because that's what we had heard as a good inclusion for these particular roles. Again, I'm gonna open it back up to the room.
I actually like calling out DEI in this scenario. I think it's important because I hear a lot about it. People questioning not why, but just trying to understand it. We do in the session provide an opportunity for people to talk about other changes that they think they're going to be encountering. So maybe that's an opportunity for these other things to come up for discussion.
And again, this is why we're going through this, right? Working together as a group. If we do think that there is a change, a controversial change that's more relevant to the scenario, we can definitely work that in. So I think, thinking about this and, I'll certainly look to Yinka and to Lise and to Chris in your regions, working with donors, working with members, are there other issues that you think are more relevant than this one? But again, knowing that we do hear from donors that this is a concern.
We look closer at the prompts within the scenario too. It's kind of backing away from DEI specifically and talking about some of the ways that the change model can be used to address problems and solve some of the problems. Moves to kind of communicating with donor in this example, but sharing communication about change and about addressing challenges. And then kind of provides that opportunity to have a discussion in the group. So writing a response to the prospective donor, maybe there are opportunities to address it in different ways based on the experiences of the individuals in those groups.
Yeah, maybe it's not so common in Europe because I didn't encounter any question about DEI. So that's why. So if there is an example, if you would share it, then it would be, I think, more easier. Maybe just here, huh? For an example, and then I can grasp what the meaning will be.
Or maybe in the leader's guide, you can preface it. Oh, I'm sorry. Somehow about that, not saying subject matter experts, but, we've become aware that there's been concerns expressed or something.
This is
to
a real
do-
world.
Exactly. To somehow present to the participants that this is a real scenario.
I can jump in. And I think this also illustrates, you have no idea how people are going to react to things, right? Because there have been policies or changes that leadership has passed that they did not think would be controversial. And then one subsection of Rotarians in some part of the country world was just horrified by, right? And so things that may seem completely normal or straightforward to one group can be very offensive or potentially problematic with another, which is, I think, an interesting thing as being part of a global organization. I would say, at least from a US perspective, I can't speak to the staff you work with. We do have donors who are concerned about the DEI policy and have made that very clear. And in a couple of ways. One is because they hear certain words, and in certain parts of the United States, those words have become synonymous with certain political parties or certain concepts that they may not approve of. Whereas if you actually get into the policy, that's not what it says, right? But they hear the words and they get very concerned. And then it may not be actually with the policy, but then they'll say things like, well, Rotary is supposed to be nonpartisan, and why is Rotary inserting itself into politics? Which I don't think it is in this case, right? We'll have that. We'll have things about Rotary is trying to force us to do X, Y, and Z with our clubs that we don't want to do. Which is, again, not what the policy says, but kind of that initial response. I like my club the way it is, and I don't want to change. People need to change. If, our club is fine, and you should change if you want to be a Rotarian. I'm not changing my club just to make, these fill in the blank young people or whatever happy. So it's some of those kinds of things. And so it doesn't always come up in a fundraising context, but it's just like, I would say it's kind of similar to people perhaps complaining about a grant that got turned down. It has nothing to do with fundraising, but it colors their perception of Rotary. And so then having a good conversation with them, if they're open to having a conversation, figuring out how to help them work through that will help them feel better about Rotary.
Actually, this is an example I recognize that the grant is turned down. So that's actually for, I think, Europe more common than the DI, because it's more accepted, I think, in Europe.
Yes. And the challenge with that is that's not necessarily it may or may not be a policy, right? It may be the grant staff disagrees with you about the policy. But it's not necessarily a change, right? Or something, a new initiative that Rotary is trying to put forward. We saw some similar things when we added the new area of focus for the environment, which again, and many people were like, great, this is overdue, we should do this. And other people heard Rotary is going to, well, their mind went to very different places than mine did. And, you know, had to have some conversations. And so then in that case, be able to talk about other Rotarians for whom this was an important issue, the kinds of things it was, working through our change model, then we can have a good conversation.
Yeah, so our team was just chatting and thinking, what if we offer two scenarios that are different and then assign the groups so that we can have discussion on both? You know, a scenario that's a little bit different than that might be relevant to different parts of the world. What do you think?
I mean, I'm certain that for the DEI scenario, for the global support group, everybody will connect with it, whether it is looking at Elevate Rotaract as a change, whether it's looking at even the gender issue, the inclusion issue, and so that will make a great conversation, you know, in that group. You know, I just wanted us to look at this group and find that's something that can make them really think, something they can relate with, that can make them really think about the process, the model we want them to use. So maybe a solution would be two scenarios and one more relevant to their roles as maybe fundraisers, you know, or something like that.
Well, maybe this could help because empowering girls is actually something in Europe, and it's going rapidly. So that's something as well. So that could be a change.
Addressing that change.
Oh, okay. So, and sort of thinking about something that's more specific, you'd mentioned grants. So there was a change in the, you know, from 100 to 80% match for coming from the World Fund for grants. There's also, you know, a 5-year limitation on DDF carry forward. I don't know how much that's into the weeds or how broad the interest would be, but that's if you're.
I understand what you're saying, David, but I don't want to go back and dig the negative, but we have to hunt the positive. So, yeah, look forward. Yeah.
I also
Yeah.
think it's important to come up with a scenario that's going to be relevant to all the participants, not something that's specific to the United States or Africa or Asia, you know, something that's going to make sense to everybody that's in the room.
Something kind of recent, probably too. So thinking about that kind of with those parameters, something that is a change, either in Rotary or the Rotary Foundation, let's say in the last 5-ish years, 5 to 10 years, 10 at the max, something that's relevant to both EMGAs and polio coordinators, and specific to their role, right, in cultivating, soliciting, stewarding gifts.
Could it be something about leading change, working with districts to kind of reinforce that? So maybe something about district leaders want to fund money into their the share fund in the annual giving. They don't see value in either, you know, or something along those lines, and you're working to change the culture of the district or culture, something along those lines. Because I don't know that we have a lot of major changes coming out. And I agree, I don't want to go too far back because I don't know how relevant it is. Or if there's something, if we think about our action plan. Or is it change management, getting people who are not our members to donate? Like the district says it's only members. How do you get that? I don't know.
Well, some of that's not change, that's like compliance. Yeah, the only other change I can think of, and again, but this wouldn't work for the EPNCs at all is the change in how we do the Rotary Peace Centers to, kind of shifting up that model. But I don't know, that's obviously not going to be relevant to the EPNCs.
We can certainly do some brainstorming. Also, connect with our subject matter experts. Maybe try to, I've heard a couple of good ideas here. So, I think we could also try to craft maybe a couple of scenarios and send them out to this group. For input, unless we have strong feelings right now that we have an idea that we want to run with.
But don't get me wrong, Chris, I fully support your vision in globalization, so don't focus.
No, I'm just trying to think of something that would be relevant to both of the EPNCs and the EMGAs, and it's hard to come up with something, but I'm sure there's something. We just, the subject matter experts that you referred, who are those individuals? Oh, okay.
You see a couple of them right
Okay.
here. Yep.
Okay.
This is the team we usually go to first. And then they kind of connect us and farm out to other people in either philanthropy or regional leader support, polio. But these are kind of our first points of contact, and then they help us connect with other staff as well.
What about the idea of Rotaractors as donors? Is that a universal topic? How we cultivate that group?
That's an interesting one. However, if I look up at the Rotaractors, what money? Because not yet, in the future.
Yes.
So we can, yeah.
So
So
one
is
thought,
this group need change management? That's what's making me, if we cannot come up with a relevant scenario, maybe they don't need change management.
so one issue that comes up over the years is what's next after polio. And so some folks are maybe pushing the environment, some folks are pushing peace centers as kind of the next big corporate project, which would have some relevance, obviously, to EPNCs, but perhaps also as EMGAs. Just a thought.
Or even the idea of Rotaractors participating in grants. People have different feelings around the world about that also.
And how would that help? And yeah. However, I like the idea to have other scenarios and look at it. Yeah, I think that would be fine if that's possible with you.
So we can definitely look into that, to developing a scenario. We are in a bit of a short timeline. So we'd have to develop it probably this week and send it to all of you for feedback early next week at the latest. But, to Sarah's point, if we don't think that there's anything relevant, is this session valuable? I am of the personal opinion that all Rotary leaders need change management, but if we are not coming up with relevant scenarios, or, we think that the content isn't globally relevant, I'm struggling a little bit with how we move forward.
Or are we reworking the activity so it's not based into a scenario, but it's more of the kind of discussion questions, focused on communication, managing relationships when there are difficulties, we kind of remove the scenario piece if that's the real barrier right now.
I think you could do the DDF scenario because the 5 years is about to happen and they are going to start the rollover. That they haven't hit the 5 years, so they are going to have to actually manage that change with donors and districts of like giving them the DDF. The EPNCs will have an opportunity to ask for DDF to be given as part of that rollover. and donors as they learn more as it's starting to actually happen. Because right now it's just a theory that you're not going to be able to roll it over. And we're just now starting to track what is 5 years old. But it hasn't necessarily been to districts yet that they have this 5-year-old DDF that they need to spend this year, or it's going to the World Fund.
Earlier in the session, we have the question about what kinds of change in Rotary or the foundation you anticipate needing to address during your term as regional leader, and there will obviously be discussion on that. What if in the activity we revisit something like that, like what kinds of changes are you anticipating being difficult or would like to kind of discuss with your small group, and kind of putting it back to the participants to really make it about them, make it something that is applicable to them, that they're concerned about, or just need help navigating a little bit, so that we're not presenting them with something, they're coming up with the few brief ideas.
Yeah, I think that may be good. That is, they have that conversation.
Mhm.
They distill out a few things they think these are the changes we need to encounter. And then we then tell them, based on the last work you've done, apply this change model to find solutions. Yeah, maybe that may work.
I'm still open to the scenario, but I just wanted to propose something else if we want to just move in a slightly different direction.
There have been some great ideas mentioned here. I'm one of things sort of related to change or that need some finesse and negotiation. Would we want to use some of those different topics as prompts in the leader's guide if the participants don't come up with anything?
May I add something? What is the change I experienced is that donors are giving now to the Disaster Response Fund because of the war in Ukraine. And I think that's a change, because that's also a change for me as a IMGA. And it was really easy to get money in this way. So I know it's part of the annual fund, but it's another way.
I think there's some really good examples that are relevant to the EMGAs and others to the End Polio Now. It's coming up with something that both of them will get something out of in the discussion.
To revisit one of the earlier ideas about cultivating Rotaractors as donors, the sentiment in this room was, what money? To me, that already says that there's an issue with, change management. Yes, maybe they don't have money now, but maybe there are some. Is there something there? I think Sarah mentioned Rotaractors, earlier, as donors as an idea. Is there a mindset change that we need to work on? Maybe not at the second, right, that Rotaractors, but long-term, how are we working on cultivating them, kind of bringing them into the foundation fold, since they haven't really been in there. Now they have some grants, eligibility. I'm just trying to think through some other things, again, that could be relevant to both groups.
That's a good idea.
I would say that from a major gifts perspective, I mean, just they aren't prospects for major gifts because they haven't been involved long enough and they don't have generally the kind of wealth assets that we'd be looking for. So I think there's an aspect of how to have them begin contributing to the foundation, which is really critical to growing them into long-term donors, major donors, probably more of an RFC role though, right? In terms of pulling them in to become annual donors, become polio donors, things like that. So I think if you put that in, I think the EMGAs would push back and be like, that there's nothing for us to work with right now because they're not, and you're not wrong. It's just because we don't have, because they're not currently in any of the reports. So we don't have any of the giving data from them. So so the way that major donors grow is they start off as annual donors, right? And then begin to move up. So that's where we just don't even have any data. And so we don't even have their membership records. So I can see there being a lot of pushback from EMGAs that if we have their information, we'll go fundraise from them. But right now we don't. We're like a couple of years out from that. Kind of like you were saying about the DDF and the polio. It's like we can see it coming, but we can't quite do much of it yet.
So one thing I would mention from like a DEI perspective, the idea that like, how are they on the horizon? How are we starting that relationship building with them? That might be an issue that we kind of explore, is not necessarily how do you turn them into donors today, but how do you even, that whole mindset aspect, that they're not thought of as a program, that they're thought of as members, that they have this potential that we don't necessarily know exactly what it is. But I think it's not necessarily how do they get a major gift from them, but how are we starting to think of them as donors and starting to put them in the pipeline.
And come to think of it, Sarah, if a Rotaractor gives, I mean, Rotaractors are donating to polio now. They're donating to the annual fund now, you know, but I'm not sure they're really donating to the endowment fund. You know, I mean, they could give $500, $1,000 to the endowment fund. That's still the endowment. But the opportunity I tend to see is that if we manage this change well, it may be a Rotaractor who understands Rotary, who goes to tell a grandparent to leave a bequest or a legacy, or may even be the one that will in his corporate world, for example, hazarding guesses.
I think Barry would love you to have something in here about Rotaract.
So I guess we've got a couple of options. So do we want to pursue the scenario that we have now, right? The current scenario and then adding an additional scenario, working on either some of the ideas that we talked about, you know, either something related to grants, DDF, maybe cultivating Rotaractors in the future, or do we want to shift it away kind of in a different perspective that Madeline was talking about?
I was also going to say not to introduce another option, but it sounds like one of the concerns is that nothing is necessarily applicable to both roles intimately. What if the scenarios were one for EPNCs, one for EMGAs, and then they still discussed?
I
It
would,
would
I
still
would
be-
vote for keeping the DEI and adding
Adding,
a second one. That would be my vote.
Do we have consensus on a second scenario idea? It doesn't have to be totally fleshed out yet. We can work with the experts on the details, but anything kind of from our brainstorming here that feels like this is the direction we should go for topic 2?
I think Leanne would agree with me that there has been discussion from the EPNCs on how to get Rotaractors involved, so if that is the direction, EPNCs are looking for ways to get them involved in polio eradication and polio fundraising, but it may not work so well for the EMGAs, but that would work for us.
Other thoughts?
And I would add, over the last 2 years, we have started recognition specific for Rotaractors. So I think it's 5 Rotaractors in a club, and we recognize the club at $100. So the scale is definitely different. And that is an issue for the EMGAs. But the goal of getting them in the pipeline is certainly a long-term one.
So
There you
then,
go.
so what I'm hearing is kind of Sarah's earlier point, not necessarily like they should be on your prospect list to, you know, cultivate and solicit next week, but this is a organizational shift. We're shifting the mindset of our regions and our districts about who Rotaractors are to us. And so kind of thinking about that. So maybe it's again, we can start work on some of the details. Is that what I'm hearing? That we're trying to figure out how to get different Rotary leaders thinking about Rotaract, even if it's not this second, they are part of our future, right? And so how are we kind of working with them a little bit?
And exactly, they have 3 years to come. So they have to plant the seed to prosper.
Right? I think that's a good point of focusing on the individuals as individuals who are amplifying the change at this point, and then it will continue to build through their role for the 3 years. It will continue to build along the succession line as they become the predecessor to someone else. So see how it would work.
I think you can point to the, the correlation between membership and total contributions, and also the fact that we need to be developing resources beyond just Rotarians.
And come to think of it,
That's
from
why I named it.
the first step process point of view, at the identification point, we shouldn't ignore 200,000 potentials, from the identification point. So
Okay, so it sounds like we'll head in that direction. We will work on the details of that scenario with the team. And then send that out to everyone shortly.
Getting back into the leader's guide and the workbook. So we were on workbook page 2, leader's guide page 4, as we were discussing the planning for a change section. In the leader's guide, we then moved to the key points. Continued on to page 5, addressing resistance. A discussion question asking what to do if you come across resistance to change, and a few sample responses. Following that are additional key points about developing good relationships with district leaders, planning for changes together, really using that team. And the importance of moving through the change model as it's designed, not skipping steps, but really kind of utilizing each step. And then we end the session with a review, talking about the critical role that each individual has in helping district leaders understand and implement change, focusing on Rotary's change model as a guide, and making sure you're addressing cultures throughout your region as you adapt the change framework. That session ends with that same section, your goals, answering questions from a discussion that are outstanding, reviewing the learning objectives, and filling out the relevant evaluation. Before we move on to the next section, any final comments or questions about the leading change session?
Just a comment, Madeline.
Yeah.
I know Barry's, talked a lot about how we feel it's so important that the time that we're spending with these regional leaders is going to affect the districts and get to the club level, because Rotary happens at the club level.
Yep.
So I think anywhere in the materials, where it's appropriate to talk about, okay, helping district leaders understand and implement change at the club level to make sure that, they're not implementing change at the district, but it's not getting down to our individual members and positively affecting the clubs.
Chris, I think that's a great point. And from the EMGA perspective too, is it helping our donors really understand the why behind the changes? Right?
Great. Thank you. Okay, we are now on session 6, page 1 of the Leader's Guide, session 6, page 1 of the workbook. And in the workbook, we're on a new day, so we're in a new grouping with the paperclip. This session will be just for EMG EMGAs, it's the 4-step process, and it's a 2-part session. So it'll go from a long morning session, 9:45 to 12, with a break in the middle of this two parts. For the learning objectives, we're asking participants to be able to perform each step of the 4-step process and understand how to work with fund development staff partner. We move to the next page of the Leader's Guide on page 2. We start our introduction with the facilitator referring participants to the workbook. So that workbook will include parts 1 and part 2. They review the learning objectives with the participants and then refer participants to our first page of the workbook, 4-step process. And there'll be a notes section for participants to take notes. From there, we go to a discussion question. Have you asked someone personally to make a gift to the Rotary Foundation or another organization, large or small, and what was your experience? This key points follow. Referring back to the graphic and the 4 steps: identification, cultivation, solicitation, and donor stewardship. The idea of donor centricity. And then the resource, your fund development staff partner who can coordinate the steps.
Can we look at that last bullet
Yes.
where it says at the very end, and serve as a subject matter expert? It breaks to page 2. I wonder if that concept of subject matter expert is as common in the field. So is it possible to say to serve as an expert on foundation giving or on the Rotary Foundation, or I don't know what would be the appropriate, or an expert on major gifts?
Any strong feelings in the room about any of those, or all could potentially work?
Concept is to serve, of that sentence is to kind of serve as the fundraising expert. We were chatting before about, we don't expect EMJs to be experts in tax law or all the ways you can structure a gift or many other things.
Yeah.
Yada, 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 which also does not translate well. I would not recommend putting yada, yada, yada. But I think that was kind of the concept. So I don't know if it's a fundraising expert or foundation expert or kind of what it is, but it's like all of that technical, specific stuff that we spend a lot of time trying to stay on top of. So you don't have to. Whatever, so translate that.
Okay. Noted. Okay. From there, we move to identification in the leaders. So we're on page 3. Key points: discuss identification, what that involves, and after the training, participants will work with a staff partner to develop a list of major gift prospects. From here, we have our activity. So the facilitator will direct participants to refer to the identifying prospective donors section. That's on page 1 in the workbook. They'll do the activity with their staff partner group, and everyone will be assigned a donor scenario. So as you were flipping through, there are a lot of different scenarios, there are a lot of different sections. Individuals, once they're assigned a scenario, will follow that specific scenario through each step. In the workbook, we start with one example scenario with our participant Sharon, and we work through a profile of that individual and particular questions.
May I ask something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
There are 2 names for the IMGAs. So is there a preference or is it just switching roles?
David, for the 2 EMJs, will there be one or the other in the room, Mary or Marge?
So I can answer this. So EMGA's Mary Shackleton and Marge Cole will be in the room. They are the participants. They will work with the donor Sharon throughout this entire session. And then Marge's staff partner and Mary's staff partner will sit next to them and also work through the entire scenario of Sharon with them. Yep, so they'll be paired together. And then you can see the next scenario of Lloyd, which is on workbook 6-5. Dominic will work with Lloyd as his donor, and Dominic will be with the staff partner throughout the whole scenario. Yep.
However, the name Dominic is spelled incorrectly. So
In the leader's guide on page 4. At the top of the page, we have our discussion question asking about criteria that can be used to determine whether someone may be a good prospective donor. And the italicized font of our sample responses. Our key point, the list you develop with your staff partner will evolve throughout your 3-year term as you learn more about potential donors. And I'll pause there. Any other comments or questions about that section of the session?
I wonder if it's better to move the point about they need to work on a list of 15 with their partner after they do this activity.
Before the discussion question?
No, like, so
Or
at the end, we have
after
the list you
entirely.
develop with your staff partner. I mean, I'm not sure why we mentioned it before, because I don't know if people will be thinking about that versus focusing on the activity.
Okay,
The one advantage of having it there is it just gives a sense of how much identification you're gonna be doing, because we have had people in the past who've gone way, way beyond that number. So maybe it's not an instruction, but more like your goal is to identify 15
mhm.
or something like that. So then it gives them a sense of,
Is it kind of like the best practice is to identify about 15 donors?
I think it's actually, yeah, I think it was in the subsection of the goals where the goal was to do 5 gifts. And I think part of that was come up with a list of 15 people to get 5. Yeah. So that was kind of the ratio that they were looking at in earlier when we were talking about best practices related to their goals. It doesn't have to say here. I think it just kind of helps to give a sense of scope.
Great.
Yeah, I wonder if we just mention that, like, you know, that it's a best practice to reach your goal of getting at least 5 major donors. To me, it just seemed like an outlier of when I saw it.
Seemed like an outlier.
Yeah. But I think if you give context that it's part of your, to get you to your goal, I think that makes more sense.
Great. Back in the leader's guide on page 4, under the cultivation section, we begin with a discussion question. How have you seen prospective donors cultivated in your region or elsewhere? Followed by a few sample responses. Then following that, we have our key points focused on cultivation as
When we did the identification one, I mean, we know these are English words. You know, we may think people will just know what they mean. But when identification one, we started with the first step, identification, involves looking for. So there was a definition or an explanation of what we meant. But this one, we just went straight to, how have you seen prospective donors cultivated? What is cultivation? So is it okay to also have some kind of definition or explanation of what cultivation is before that question?
oh, wow.
At the top of page 5, moving those key points, you mean?
Yeah,
You're
okay.
explaining
Mhm.
what they would use before you ask the
Question
Okay.
similar
maybe.
to, yeah.
Yeah.
So again, on page 5 of the Leader's Guide, our key points, focus on cultivation. Our second one, a large part of cultivation work is something you're probably already doing, talking to Rotary members about their experiences and what's meaningful to them. And that takes us to our practice. So the facilitator will ask participants to do the activity with their staff partner group and refer them back to their scenario in the workbook. Page 2, we start with our cultivation practice. Again, we're focusing on that individual who was already assigned. So if this person was working with Sharon previously, they continue working with Sharon. Move through the questions of the cultivation step. And end by thinking about the goal, how they prepare for a meeting or activity, what they would do before, during, and after. And then I will pause here for cultivation. Any other comments or questions about this section? Yeah, Chris?
When they're working through these scenarios, they're not role playing, right? They're just working together to answer the question. Okay,
Correct.
thank you.
Just a note that we'll need to assign our pending EMGA to a scenario. I don't know if who wants to make that note, but I just noticed the names and was checking.
In our leader's guide on page 5, we in the cultivation step, we'll have our break for 15:06. We will begin the solicitation step. Again, for this one, we start with key points. So makes sense. Yep. Going back to that cultivation step to kind of move those so that the definition comes first. So back to solicitation, we begin with our brief definition and then move to our discussion question. What signs from prospective donors could indicate that they are ready to make a major gift or bequest? Number of sample responses, pending what comes up in the discussion. And from there, our key points focused on our staff partner support, and that people should know that they're being cultivated as potential donors, so a request for a major gift should not be a surprise. Here, the facilitator will refer the participants to their solicitation practice, again, continuing to work with their staff partner group. And this section does include a little bit of role playing, but they're still focused on that participant, on that scenario example. It's just a little bit more support in this solicitation step because it makes sense for that particular step.
Madeline, can I ask?
Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
On page 6-7 of the leader's guide at the top, the key points. Just thinking about non-native speakers, pinpoint, maybe your staff partner can help you determine the right time to ask for a gift, or just replacing that word.
Identify could also be a good use.
Thank you. Then from here, we'll take a look at our solicitation practice in the workbook on page 3 in the workbook. While our scenario again, I'm focusing on a major gifts initiative event, using Sharon as the example. move through questions, asking who else should be invited to the solicitation meeting, where would you suggest the meeting take place, and thinking about how you'll secure the gift, writing what you'll say. So that's that role-playing aspect. Any questions about that practice before we move to the next section? The solicitation section in the leader's guide on page 7 does go to a discussion question following the practice. What are the most important things you learned from the activity, with a few sample responses? Then the facilitator asks a few of the groups to share their scenarios and demonstrate solicitation as they practiced. And on the next page, page 8 of the leader's guide, we end that section with key points. Identifying the person best suited to ask for a major gift, which is something that's come up in our conversation over the last day and a half. Focused on as an EMJ, you'll likely be the EMGA, you'll likely be the person who will ask most of your prospective donors for a major gift. At times there might be someone who's better suited. And then finally, if a prospective donor declines to make a major gift, finding out why and returning to the cultivation stage if appropriate. Before moving to the stewardship section, any other questions or comments?
Hi, when I look at this and then I go to the next one, there is a lot of the facilitator talking. If for the stewardship, is there time to ask them, like, how do you like to be thanked when you make a gift? Or something to prime that a little bit?
I think there definitely is an opportunity to add that, whether it's a question of adding before the key points or after, kind of keeping it consistent with the other sections. So that the definition.
I'm
But-
going to advocate for it before, because we're
Right.
not using the word stewardship. So how do you like to be thanked when you give a gift? I mean, you could think about that in any way. If like that's why I think sometimes we don't need to explain everything before we get them talking.
And then to your point, Sarah, it breaks it up, right? If you insert the question there, because there's key points from the previous section too.
Good point. Okay. So we'll start with a discussion question about being thanked, about stewardship and defining that step. And on page 9 in our leader's guide, ending with a key point, thoughtful stewardship can also help cultivate a donor's next gift. Right before we move to our activity, the donor stewardship activity is on page 4 in the workbook. Continuing to work with the staff, fund development staff partners. Participants will work through this scenario. So in the workbook on page 4, we'll follow that same individual that they began with, work through the list of donor stewardship activities that work well in some of the regions of the world, and considering the ideas and how they could be adapted. Then looking closely at the scenario about, again, an example, Sharon, and responding to the questions. How would you steward this donor immediately following the gift? List 1 or 2 stewardship options. How would you continue to steward the donor over time? And that closes the activity. The stewardship section ends with a discussion question. How do you determine the best way to steward a donor once they have made a gift? Are there special ways donors are thanked in your region? Questions or comments about the stewardship section before moving on?
I mean, obviously, Dory and David, you guys spend time on this, but with donors who want to be anonymous, and maybe how that might be a little bit different than someone who can publicly be thanked.
Be built in one of the scenarios, but that's just one of them. No, I think it's certainly important. We're talking about recognition and stewardship.
It's a good point. I think that was in the donor-centric session that we don't have, but yeah, that's a good point about people who want to be anonymous and things like that. Maybe it can just be a point that there are people who may wish to remain anonymous. We don't necessarily have to get into all the details about what that looks like or how that works, but.
I support that because in the Netherlands, I have one bequest and he wanted to be anonymous and not only for the district leader not to know and so on. And unfortunately, the RFC said, well, this is a major donor, so why won't he become a Parallel Hair Society member? So there was a call and then he called me straight away and said, I said to you, I don't want to be called by anyone. So that's something. And it was a huge gift, I can assure you.
I think that highlights the cultural and regional differences, obviously. And we know some parts of the world, even wearable recognition isn't worn. Other parts of the world, it's celebrated and it's a significant motivation for donors.
In the whole of this, we seem to have excluded references to corporate gifts. We seems to have suggested that you should only cultivate and solicit Rotarians. What of corporates?
No.
Is that not encouraged?
No, it's not their role to get corporate money. I used to do that for Rotary. It's very difficult to do that. So we do have the CSR program in India. But that's not the EMGA's working on that. I mean, not primarily, it's not the EMGA's primary role there. That's a very specialized kind of work that needs to be done. And there's people who are very good at it and it works better in some countries than others. Sometimes it works better going to a district or to a club than coming to the foundation. So we really try to keep the EMGAs focused on working with individual Rotarians.
So I would add, we've had little success in fundraising with corporates over the years. The fit for what the corporations need compared to what we're able to offer has not been a very good one. We have seen movement lately. We've had very successful now first year of our CSR program in India. So we've had 55 corporations supporting us in 1 year, which is great. But it's an acorn, it's a seed of where we need to be. I think the overall message is, we got 1.2 million, 1.4 million Rotary members. And about 90%, if you take out Gates Plus, is our contributions are currently from Rotarians. So that's our primary focus. There are opportunities for corporates to support the foundation, but it's pretty narrow, primarily like directed gifts for grants. And that even isn't much of a fit. So there are opportunities, but the primary focus is on individuals.
The other thing I'd love to say is less than a third of Rotarians give at all to the foundation. And all of our big gifts come from a few thousand out of our 1.4 million members give all of our big gifts. So we have plenty of people who can give us money. So once we get all those folks done, then it makes sense to look outside. But if we can't convince our own members to support us, then I think we have a harder sell externally. Doesn't mean it can't be done. We have some folks in the States who are financial advisors or attorneys who are Rotarians, and they work with their clients, encourage them to give to us. But our model is very different than most nonprofits. And so explaining that to a non-Rotarian why they should give to share makes no sense. Polio is an easier sell. But other than that, a lot of our things are a little bit more complex for non-Rotarians to be passionate about.
Okay, so if I hear you well, you are saying that I find a corporate, say a bank, that says, I like your peace program. We would like to support it with $100,000. We should tell the EMGA, tell them we are not interested.
No, I think if they're approached, obviously we can work with them. But to ask an EMGA to go out and to try to find those corporate donors is very difficult. Most of them don't have the skills to do that, and corporate fundraising is different than individual fundraising, both in terms of how you approach it. Most companies want something in return. They want name recognition, they want naming rights, they want publicity, they want to be on the website, they want volunteer opportunities for their staff, things like that. And Rotary generally can't do that, at least not at the headquarters level. So that becomes a real challenge.
Not to go too far in the weeds, but we had to create basically a whole new corporate social responsibility program. So corporates in India could support the foundation. We tried it with with global grants for 4 years. Just was not a good fit. They generally want a project in a particular area. Maybe it's near their headquarters. Other criteria that the foundation just isn't able to meet within the current guidelines. So that was a 5-year process to be able to do it in one country at this point. So we are making progress, but generally for the scope of this training, it wouldn't be as relevant as individual giving.
Yeah, we've also found corporations want to be able to direct where their money is going to go and what they're going to use it for. And our whole model is about Rotarians deciding what they're going to do with the funds. And so when we were working with Coke on some water projects, they wanted this certain kind of water project in a certain location. But then that would have required headquarters to tell the Rotarians in that country, you have to do this kind of a project in this location. And that's not really what our model is. And companies don't want to, Rotarians are usually pretty good about saying, sure, I trust the Rotarians in that district to design and develop a good project. Here's my money. What a corporation's going to want, I want to know that they're going to install this kind of utility system and do this kind of maintenance and use these kind of filters and do this kind of analysis over a 5-year period. And we're just not, our model's completely flipped from that.
I know we have a couple minutes left, but we just have a little bit left of the session before lunch. Before I go through the review section, which is our final section of the Leader's Guide on page 9, I just wanted to refer us back to the workbook. So we had left off on workbook page 4. And then if you flip over, starting on workbook page 5, it'll be the same content that we just covered, just the individual scenarios. So we go through those steps, the identifying prospective donors, cultivation practice, solicitation practice, and donor stewardship, again, for each of the scenarios. And that takes us to all the way to the end, page 22 of the workbook. And we end the Leader's Guide with the review section, starting with key points about the 4-step process and working with your fund development staff partner. Last key point on page 10 of the Leader's Guide. The process is not always sequential. Sometimes you may need to go back to a previous stage before moving to our last facilitator note section, referring to the goals, learning objectives, outstanding questions, and the relevant evaluations. Are there any additional questions about the 4-step process, part 1 and part 2, about the Leader's Guide or workbook sections that we want to cover before closing out this session?
Do we have the pretty graphic that we're going to use?
We are getting the pretty graphic, yes. That's the placeholder. Yeah. Okay, I think we're ready to break then for lunch.
Nice
so-
job, Madeline,
Thank you.
and your team,
Yeah,
and your
we'll-
team.
We'll come back and pick up with session 7, and we'll come back at 1:30, I believe. Yeah, 1:30. Evanston time.
So I think we're saying good night to Meanne. Thank you, Meanne, for your help in participating, and we'll be sure to include you on any of the follow-up emails afterwards with the notes and everything like that.
Thank you. It's morning. It's 2 in the morning.
Oh, my
my
goodness. Thank you,
goodness.
Meanne,
you.
so much.
Good morning. Bye.
All right, are we ready to start again with our curriculum review, finishing up our sessions? We've got a couple left.
Yeah, just a few sessions left. We will start our afternoon section with a session focused on End Polio Now coordinators, the how to get to 50 million and end game strategy. So if that's, we're opening up your binder again. That is session 7, page 1, workbook 7, page 1. So again, this is just for End Polio Now coordinators, occurring Tuesday morning. Our learning objectives focus on understanding the EPNC role and how Rotary intends to raise 50 million, as well as understanding GPEI, Global Polio Eradication Initiative, and Rotary's polio endgame strategy.
Madeline? Can I
Yes.
jump in on
Yes.
learning objective 1? I believe know what the EPNC role is was covered in session 1.
role.
Can we shorten this learning objective to focus more on understand how Rotary intends to raise 50 million?
Yes. Comfortable with that? Our third learning objective, sharing best practices for encouraging clubs and districts to support polio eradication. The other feedback about the learning objectives.
Can we reword number 2?
Yes.
To understand the GPEI endgame strategy and Rotary's role? Because it's really the GPEI's endgame that we're a part of.
Okay. Then our workbook sections, we'll have the learning objectives, a polio presentation, tentatively by John Germ, how to get to 50 million and polio eradication strategy. Our timeline in the leader's guide will follow the introduction, that same presentation by John Germ, committing to polio eradication, GPEI and endgame strategy, and a review. So we'll begin that on page 2 of the leader's guide.
Madeline, do you want to,
Yes.
under the workbook, do you want to change that last one
Time.
to say polio endgame? Polio eradication endgame strategy?
We want to match that to the learning
Yeah.
objective. Okay. Okay, and then in our leader's guide, I'm starting with the introduction, welcoming participants, reviewing learning objectives, which the participants will have in their workbook, and I'll match to our leader's guide. Start with our presentation by John Germ. So we've set aside 20 minutes for this, and participants will listen and have space in their workbook for notes or questions. Following that presentation, we move to the section committing to polio eradication and begin with a discussion question. Why is it important to maintain our commitment to eradicating polio? Followed by key points, focused on the updated agreement between Rotary and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Clubs are encouraged to give 1,500 or more each year towards polio eradication. And finally, districts are encouraged to give 20% or more of their starting DDF to Polio Plus. Questions or comments about the discussion question or key points?
Do you want to say that districts are encouraged to give 20% or more of their starting DDF every year or each year, like you did with the clubs up above? I mean, it should be understood,
Yeah.
but
Definitely take note. Then we move to our first workbook section on this page, how to get to 50 million. So in our workbook on page 1 of session 7, participants will use the space to take notes We have a discussion question. How do you share the importance of eliminating polio with districts and clubs in your area? That matches the leader's guide.
Can I ask a question? I'm not sure how I would respond to that question. What are we trying to ask there?
Do have the sample response communicating stories about polio fundraising, giving, or immunization projects.
So to me,
that-
in a way, are we trying to get them the why that they should be telling the importance of giving, like because we want to eradicate polio, because it's a crippling disease. And I thought the question was going in that direction, but then polio fundraising is the first point cited. So again, it's more focused on the money and not on what the effort is. And it's like, how do you share? I would be like via email or, so I don't know if it's like, what are the messages that you want? What are the important messages that you share with members about eliminating polio? Maybe something like that.
Mhm.
And I would hate to lead with fundraising at this point.
Well, also, what about when and how? When do they have the opportunity to communicate and where? I mean, I don't, like you said, is it email? Is it at district events? Is it at pets? Is it, what are we trying to get them to do or respond to?
And one of the things that has come from a subcommittee of the International Polio Plus Committee is on communications is having focus on positive messaging. So even focusing on like, well, we're still in Pakistan and Afghanistan, the region of Pakistan is just so much smaller. So like, maybe it would also be sharing the good news and not just like, there was an outbreak in like London and like that there is progress being made, even if it doesn't seem that if you just look at the numbers, it doesn't seem like we're making progress, but there are things that are indicating progress being made. So maybe that could be add the importance and the progress being made.
Emphasizing that.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I'm kind of like, so they start the session, John comes in and gives a presentation. And do we know what John is going to talk about?
Not yet.
So we want them to be able to say, why is it important to maintain our commitment? And the idea there is we've worked so far, we've worked so long, we want to finish it, and we have this extra funding, right? Is that essentially the beginning goal?
Sarah, if I were to guess what John would talk about in his would be the progress and then the importance of polio eradication for the legacy of Rotary, and why it's important that we get to 50 and how sharing the good news or the progress will get us to 50. Really focusing on those positive stories or the positive progress that is not just seen in a case count.
Are we assuming that everything we have from 10:10 to 10:25 would not have been covered by John's presentation? Because his presentation typically will cover all of those. Unless we just want to use it to test whether they actually listened to him.
I think these were points that we wanted to reinforce and we're not sure what John is going to say. So we wanted some guarantees in the session.
Maybe part of the disconnect is the question and the key points, because the question is about why is it important to retain our commitment, which is about fulfilling our promise to the children of the world generally, right? And these are well, we've committed to the Gates Foundation, we're gonna do it. Right, which is a very different, clubs are asked to give and just, it's very different, right? So it's like, if we want to talk about why is it important, then I think getting at that heart of why Rotary is invested in polio, which is different than what are we asking Rotarians to do to help us get there? Those are kind of two separate. They're both important, but they're kind of separate conversation points.
And going back to the session that's before this, thinking about what's going to be covered in the general session also, right? We don't want necessarily it to be duplicated. We want it to be building on that messaging.
Could we rephrase the question to be more of like, what is important to your club and districts to get them to support polio? So like, they're talking more about like the regionalization of what points are important. Like, it could be different, like, it could be that it'll save a lot of money and for the US government once polio is eradicated, because they won't be making these allocations. Like, that could be important in certain regions of the United States, or it could be, it's really important that all children get their vaccines, will resonate at different places. So they could talk about what points here, like what will encourage, or what stories will encourage people to give, or what is
Kind
the
of in your
why?
region, what motivates members to support polio eradication?
Yes, and then they would probably repeat back some of what John said, but we would then learn like certain points that senior leaders make or that we make about polio are going to resonate in different areas differently.
In your region, what motivates members to support polio eradication? Do you feel like that aligns better with the key points, or do we want to make updates to the key points as well to match kind of the sentiment?
I think the benefit of that question is everybody can answer it,
Can you
so that the key points are more building on it and less explaining, responding to that question.
Yes. So in your region, repeating the question, in your region, what motivates members to support polio eradication? Could confirm we're talking about that as the replacement to the initial discussion question under the committing to polio eradication section.
Yeah, that works for me. And then I think the next question, instead of how do you share the importance, will be more like, what will you do to motivate members to give? Because I think if you go to that section of the workbook, it's how to get to 50 million.
Mm-hmm.
So I would think that they should be talking about what are going to be your strategies to raise funds in your district. So that they're talking more about the why up above.
Mm-hmm.
And then now they're talking more about sharing some strategies. Like they're being given those key points, give them their challenge, right? They're committed to raising 50 million. We want clubs to give 1,500 and districts to designate 20% of DDF.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like this question is building on how are you going to do that?
So rephrasing that question, what will you do to motivate members to give? What are your strategies to raise funds in your region? And that closes out that discussion question, followed by new key points, discussing increasing major gifts for polio by promoting matching opportunities and encouraging additional donations. And then if you turn the page 4, sharing that you're not alone in fundraising for polio, working with your team, sharing your support with district governors, governors-elect, district polio plus chairs in an effort to meet those goals. Does the room feel comfortable with those key points matching our kind of newly evolved question?
I think it flows better personally.
Then in the workbook, page 1, we'll also update that question under the how to get to 50 million for the participants.
When you reference the regional team that you work with, in that first bullet point, do you want to also include district Rotary Foundation chairs?
No foul. Okay. Our next section on page 4, session 7, global polio eradication initiative endgame strategy will be updated to match. Starting with key points. In 2020, GPI revised and strengthened polio eradication strategy through 2026. Focus on eradication, integration, containment, and certification. Then we move to activity, polio eradication strategy. So that's on page 1 of your workbook. Participants are asked a series of prompts, represent a selection of events and activities that align with Rotary's endgame strategy, and to respond with what they would do. The initial question, lead and support events such as World Polio Day events to fundraise at the club and district levels and foster greater awareness of polio. If you flip the page over, we have 2 more.
Can I ask a
Communicate-
question?
Oh yeah, Sarah?
So should it be, the prompt be something more like list events such as World Polio Day that you will lead and support to fundraise at the club and district level? I feel like the prompt isn't giving them direction. When I read it, I'd be like, okay, I'll do that. Not what am I gonna write in the
Right,
box?
Okay. Reword. Excuse me. This next few could be reworded as well. Our next one, communicate polio updates, including sharing and acknowledgement of outbreaks and emphasizing the continuation of vaccines. And finally, support pledging and individual donation opportunities to urge action in polio eradication.
Madeline, could we add also something here about recognizing donations so that they also know that that's part of their, like, once somebody gives a gift, we'd like them to thank them as well. If they know about it.
So the communicate one, do we want to think of something about the positive messaging too?
To
And is
match.
it just
Mhm.
communicate updates, or is it communicate why people need to give?
I think for the EPNCs, we want them to communicate to get a gift. So like, I think that needs to be, like, if they're sending out information, the follow-up on there should be a call to action.
Yeah, and then maybe that's partly to what they're working in. What is your call to action, or what are you gonna? And it's almost like, or are they developing a communication plan? Because we want them to be strategic, right? In how they're communicating, when they're communicating.
They should have a communication plan because there's 2 sort of really big events throughout the year. There's World Polio Day and then World Immunization Week. And then there's things that happen. So like, I think they can have you have to be prepared for when like the New Yorks and London occur, or there's an outbreak and like a Malawi. So we need some flexibility to be able to on the news, but also being prepared, like, there are events that they're going to need to know are coming. So starting your World Polio Day plans early and starting your World Immunization Week. Year-end
Yeah.
DDF calls.
It's
So I
almost
think
like a crisis management kind of thing, right? That when these things happen, you need to be prepared for what you're gonna say.
That's really well said, Chris. So I wonder if it's like, this needs to be a two-prong. You have regular communications that you can plan for, and then there are crises that come up that you have to act quickly on. And kind of if you have a template developed, you can act quickly.
But when it comes to crisis communication, is that in the remit of EPNCs?
so they are the first line of getting, when emails go out about like polio events, they are in that first line of communication. So board trustees, all polio committees, and they're included in that. That also would go to their teamwork though, on who's going to be communicating that the crisis management, whether it's going to be the trustee or director of the region, or if it's going to be the EPNC. And that might be different per region. But that would also be one of those questions that they should go back to when they meet with their regional team is when crises or news happens in polio, who's going to be the communicator of it in our region? Like if a director wants to do it, that's where it should land with the questions coming back to the EPNC. So each region might have a different plan depending on who's the main communicator in that district or region.
Okay, but help me understand it. I thought if we have those kind of crises, you actually have notes, guidance coming from here to say, this is what to say, or this is our position on this. So we don't give the impression to the EPNCs that something has happened, they can just go out there and say what they feel. I thought it's usually some communication comes from the IPPC to say, this is it, this is our position, and that is what they communicate.
They do, they get guidance from here, but I guess it would also be like, how will they be prepared to get that guidance out? And are you going to be the voice of polio within your region? So that when you do get an email from Mike McGovern as chair of the IPPC saying there are cases in Malawi, like, are you prepared to take care of, like, process that action step that's being requested? So you'll get your talking points, but getting it out. And Mike's communication, it typically isn't going to then follow up with now we need your, like, our talking points won't say like donate DDF to help solve it, but an EPNC could put that call to action in there. Or they could do the follow-up calls after that has come, you know, offering to answer questions or put them in contact to the right person. Being a resource when there's news, I think is really what we're looking for them to be able to do.
Well, and I could see district polio chairs reaching out to the End Polio Now coordinator to help them with messaging to the clubs. So just knowing how to share the news and how to present it. If that makes sense.
Yeah. In reviewing the last question or last prompt, support pledging and individual donation opportunities to urge action in polio eradication. Are there further updates you want to make to that one?
Have we talked about pledging up to this point? Is that a new word we're using for just this question?
Yes.
So I guess I would not be sure what you meant by that if I was an attendee.
Keep it to individual donation opportunities.
Yeah, who makes pledges for polio eradication donations?
There would be a few, some major gift pledges, but that would really, that's different. And pledges otherwise are really done at a country level. So I think we would be confused. I'm good with changing it to just individual donations because every other pledging is going to talk about, and polio will be about government pledging funds to GPEI.
So I guess one of my questions is for the role of the EPNC. Do we need them talking about like the different activities they'll do, bringing some creativity to fundraising, or that like, I see the goals are, we have club goals and we have district goals. Do we want them to spend time talking about those? Like, how are you going to get districts? What strategies will you use to get districts to commit 20% of their DDF? What strategies will you use to get clubs to donate 1,500?
Sarah, that's covered in the next and lesson
Oh,
8.
okay. Okay. Thanks, Claire.
So can I just ask a question about this last support? So you take out pledging, support individual donation opportunities to urge action in polio eradication. What does that mean? What are we asking them to do?
Focus more on the individual and how that can have an impact as well. Not just communicating about polio or presenting these events, but still focusing in on the donors as well.
So could we say something like, how will you encourage individuals to donate to polio eradication or something like that?
Yeah. Following our activity, we end, oh, yeah,
Before
yeah.
we go to the activity, just going back to page 1 of the workbook.
Yeah.
That question that was rephrased about leading events for World Polio Day.
Mhm.
And typically for big districts with big geography, and EPNC is not going to be able to lead these events, as it were. Is there somewhere we are going to be talking about how they work with others in those other locations to get these events on? Because lead and support will suggest, I got to do this myself. So Maria Irene is in Abidjan. She's not going to lead a polio event in Mauritius.
Right. 2 points, we will reword that question to take away the lead and support. So we talked about listing the events so that we're removing the emphasis on leading and supporting. We do talk about EPNCs working with a team to work on World Polio Day events in the teamwork session briefly as well. There's a point about that. And then,
Yeah, I know about the
Yeah.
teamwork, the teamwork itself generally, but when it comes to specific events, so we're asking to list events. If they see it as something they need to do directly, then if I'm from Ghana and I have 7 other countries, I'll probably just put the events in my location there. And I'll feel this exercise will not get me to start thinking about what to do with getting events set up in other places.
what role for the room, what role would the EPNCs play in participating in the events or leading elements of the events that you'd feel comfortable kind of rewording it so that we're still focusing on the World Polio Day events, but a little bit more singular focus on their role within the events?
Do we want to make a note of that and then we have a whole session on events and recognition.
Mhm.
And maybe see what is in there and what makes sense to either add to this session or build on in the next session.
I think correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in some parts of the world, the EPNC does organize events, and in other parts of the world, they help districts organize events. Is that correct? Okay.
Sorry. So they really, it depends on where you are in the region and the world. I know in some of the European districts, they combined together to do one big event, and the EPNCs were sort of the resource behind it. So World Polio Day is a great example of regionalization, and one size does not fit all.
So maybe there's a way to rephrase the question so that it's relevant to everybody, depending on how it's done in their part of the world. I don't have the magical answer, but there's probably a way to get them to talk about leading events or helping organize events or being a resource for organizing events or something like that.
So I guess one of the things I'm struggling is a little bit of not being super familiar with the end game strategy. But what we're asking, so what we're saying is the end game strategy is having events, doing communication, and asking for individual donations. And so that's what we want the EPNCs to do in support of that.
Right, those are just strategies to support. And what will the EPNCs, what role will they play in that?
I wonder if we make it kind of a brainstorming activity, like they have to come up with like a list of 5 different things they could do or something like that, and then sharing those a bit in the group. Because no, the new EPNCs are not covering new area, right? These are existing territories. And it seems like to me, what we're looking for is a rejuvenation, right, of giving to maintain this $50 million a year. Or is that covered in the next section?
The next section is focused on giving opportunities, different ways to give to polio. But if we want to look at reframing this activity around strategies for the Rotary's endgame strategy, and that could be events, that could be different communications, that could be individual outreach to donors.
Yeah, I even like that simple thing, like it's events, it's outreach, like it's outreach, or it's communication and it's outreach.
What does the room feel about that? Kind of reworking the framing of the scenario a little bit so that we're kind of more brainstorming, less of a prompt.
I think we could even rephrase it to how do we reach our 50 to support the end of polio? Like, because as we get to know cases, there's still gonna be money needed.
Mhm.
And it's gonna be harder to sell the story of surveillance and this lab work when you're not actively going to be seeing kids getting polio, and polio cases will be down to 0. There's still 2 years of work that need to be done to get to the end of polio. And making sure that Rotarians and members and Rotaractors understand, well, there's no cases, we're not quite done. Like,
On page 4 in the leader's guide, we do have a final discussion question that I'll open for the room. How will you serve as an advocate for the goals of the endgame strategy and engage districts in your region to fight polio? I'm on page 4 of the leader's guide at the bottom of the page. And how will you serve as an advocate for the goals of the endgame strategy and engage districts in your region to fight polio? Up on the top of page 5. Feedback about the discussion question, or are we ready to move to the review section?
Madeline, may I
Yeah.
just quickly, I know we changed a lot, but
Yeah.
while we're on the polio section, can we make sure, I saw somewhere it says the importance of eliminating polio and then eradicating polio.
Mhm.
Can we stick to eradicating because that's kind of like our corporate message? And then once you like revise everything with new questions, if there's anywhere that eliminating comes up, we can change that.
Moving to the review section on page 5. Our key points focus on the role of the EPNC to fundraise, support Rotary's advocacy efforts, and raise awareness for polio eradication. The importance that Rotary raised 50 million for polio, and using your regional leader team to support district to help meet your goals.
Madeline, just so
Yep.
for copy edit, they're gonna either want it to say polio eradication
Yeah.
or polio plus, because we're not I get caught on that one all the time. We're not promoting giving polio.
And then we
That last bullet point, is it support districts with an S?
Yes.
Thank you.
Then we close the facilitator notes. That closes that session. Then we move to our next session, session 8, page 1 of the leader's guide, opportunities for giving. This one will also be for End Polio Now coordinators only. Just kind of as a frame of reference, these 2 sessions focus on 50 million and endgame strategy. And opportunities for giving will be happening at the same time as the EMGA sessions and the 4-step process. This session begins with our learning objectives, support districts in the polio fundraising process, share best practices that address your region's needs with district leaders. We can move to page 2 of session 8 in the opportunities for giving. We start with our introduction, reviewing the learning objectives, and begin with a discussion question, which asks, by a show of hands, does your club give to Polio Plus? Key points focused on EPNC supporting polio eradication by raising awareness of polio and fundraising for Polio Plus with districts. With your support, Rotary can raise funds through contributions, DDF, and World Fund matches. And finally, use your districts or other regional leaders to help districts strengthen their polio fundraising activities.
So
So
Madeline,
base- oh.
go ahead, Sarah.
No, I was gonna say, I guess I have a little bit of concerns that only the facilitator talks at the beginning of this for quite a while. And I feel like bullets, 2 and 3 under the key points have probably already been covered through the general session and that morning's the other session. I wonder if we could make some space for some conversations about even you know, if you estimated what percentage of clubs in the districts you work with or in your region give, so that people could get a better feel for what they're up against and cut down on some of these initial key points.
Could you, instead of asking for a show of hands, could you change it to a question like, how does your club or district support Polio Plus? Or something like that?